Well, good morning again. Welcome to our second session on the webinar series on utilization of voluntary consensus standards and conformity assessment. We're going to start, as we generally do, by sharing some housekeeping messages. This session is being recorded for its future availability at the Coalition's website. We have available simultaneous translation for English, Portuguese, and Spanish. You can choose your preferred language by clicking the icon in the globe icon that is located at the bottom of your screens. All the participants' microphones are closed for us to prevent background noise. And for the Q&A sessions that we really welcome everyone's participation, we would appreciate if you can upload them at the Q&A feature, also available at the icon is also available at the bottom of your screens. So our moderators may have the opportunity to voice them to the speakers and the panelists. And for the speakers, again, we appreciate your turning on your cameras during your presentation so we may facilitate the work of our interpreters. So as you have probably seen, our latest version of the agenda shows that we have really a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of experience for all the speakers that are joining us today. We're really very appreciative for them taking the time to share all these with the coalition members and with all the regulators in our region. As you may recall, this is an event that we are producing in coordination with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration under the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project. And for the first part, we will have an overview of international reference documents on national regulatory authorities. We will have Alexandre Lemberger from PAHO sharing on critical documents that have been published by the WHO regarding the regulatory framework, good regulatory practices, and good reliance practices. Then we will have the perspective, the legal perspective on the obligations related to good regulatory practices from the national regulatory authorities. And we will close this initial session with Corey Aguino sharing on the development, adoption, and use by stakeholders, including regulatory authorities. And the second part of our session today is going to be, and the first one, sorry, is going to be moderated by Bessa Bunici from the FDA. For this second part of our session, Stephen Bipes from AdvaMed is going to be moderating this one, and we will have like a first-hand view of the activities of the standard development organizations. We have really a wonderful representation of all of them during this session, and we will be sharing some closing remarks also from Alexandre and myself. So without further ado, I would like to start by, and just give me a second so I can stop sharing my screen. That now I got. I am stuck in here. I'm so sorry. Are you still seeing my screen?
Yes, Sandra.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I finally could manage to get into stopping screen sharing. Okay. So I'd like to start then by introducing Melissa Torres. She's the Associate Director for International Affairs at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, where she is responsible for the oversight of CDRH's involvement in international programs, such as the International Medical Device Regulators Forum and Medical Device Single Audit Program. She is also responsible for managing communications on technical and regulatory issues with foreign governments and international organizations and developing policy in response to emerging international issues. Melissa, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your welcome message. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for having me here today. And I just wanted to welcome everybody today to this session. I hope you find it useful. International standards are a very important topic, especially, I would say globally, but especially even at US FDA. By trying to integrate international standards into your regulatory system, you ensure that there's alignment with international best practices and policies. At FDA, we value that standards process and are actively engaged in standards development processes. Internationally, standards have been an important point of discussion. There have been working groups in Imdrf and GHWP, for example, focused on standards, and really looking at ways and how we can improve the utility of standards for regulatory use, and looking at ways to be able to streamline regulatory review process through utilization of standards. And so I hope that you find this session useful. We're going to be highlighting a number of key standards processes, different committees, how you can integrate standards into your regulatory system. And so I hope you do find these conversations useful. And we're always here and happy to answer any questions you may have with respect to these topic areas. And again, just welcome everybody and thank you for your time this morning. We hope you enjoy the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Now I'd like to welcome also Vesa Bunici, that is going to be helping us moderating our first part of the session today. Vesa is an international relations specialist at the Latin American office of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. She's responsible there for medical products program activities in the region. Before her current position, Vesa worked at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health as an assistant director responsible for pre-market evaluation and post-market activities related to orthopedic devices, and also as a compliance officer working on post-market compliance activities for medical devices. In the past 3 years, Ms. Bunici has supported the Medical Device Single Audit Program, MDSAP, by conducting numerous witness and assessment audits in collaboration with other regulatory agencies. In addition, she has over 5 years of experience as an investigator with the FDA and is an ASQ certified quality auditor. Vesa, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Melissa and Sandra, for the introductions. It's a pleasure to be here. It is also a great pleasure of mine to start off by introducing our first speaker of the workshop, Alexandre Lemberger. He will be presenting on health references for medical device NRAs. Alexandre, since July 2011, serves as a regional advisor on health technologies management at the Pan American Health Organization in Washington, D.C. He is responsible for providing technical support for the countries in areas such as regulation of medical devices, health technology assessment and management of medical equipment. From 2003 to 2011, he was the head of the Office of Economic Evaluation of New Technologies at Anvisa. He holds a degree on chemical engineering, a master's degree on public policies, and a specialization degree on health economics. Welcome, Alexandre, and I'll hand it over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vesa. Thank you very much, Sandra, and our colleagues for this very kind invitation. I will switch to Spanish. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Voy a intentar aquí compartir.
Thank you for this invitation, and I'm going to try to share my screen with all of you. I will be speaking in Spanish today.
Me confirman, por favor, si pueden ver in presentation mode.
So hopefully you can already see my presentation. Great. So today we're going to talk about 3 documents that are very important, but I also believe that it was important to give you a context on the Americas region and all the work that the countries, the regulatory agencies, and the OPSs are doing regarding these topics. And the first part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about the regional work that we've done and the strengthening of all the regulatory capabilities in the first 5 minutes. And then the next 10 minutes, I'm going to be talking about in detail, well, not in much detail, but I will talk about more generally about the 3 documents that they requested me to present today. So this is the regional work group. I think you all know about it. We have all the member states there, but we have highlighted there the United States because the FDA recently joined this regional work group for medical devices. We're very happy about this decision and this incorporation. And so now we have 25 national regulatory agencies as part of this regional work group. Here we have the different lines that we followed for working. We did training, our participation in the regulatory agencies and technical groups, the IMDRFs, the work that is very important, as well as the technical groups to exchange information. I'm not going to go into details. I mean, these presentations are going to be shared, and if you want further detail, you could read each one of these elements afterwards. I also want to mention that we're going to have our next regional work group session in April of this year. We are still defining the dates with the members of the regional group. And here I have a couple of pictures that just make us remind in-person meeting in Colombia, and we have the open stakeholders agreement meeting, and hopefully this year we're going to have more of these. But I just wanted to leave you with these pictures so that you could see what we were doing, and we've had more than 2 years without meeting face to face. So hopefully we're going to be able to do it this year. We had several training courses, and I want to mention the one we had last year, because we cannot mention all of them. This was the activity we held last year with our colleagues from INVIMA. It was a virtual class, but we had over 125 participants from the different countries, the surveillance committees and the different modules that we had there. That's what we talked about, and that's what the training was about. We also had another important activity with regulatory exchanges, where we exchanged information on medical devices and adverse events of the same. We have the important participation of SecMed, a regulator in Cuba. We had the participation of other regulatory agencies also. And right now we have 44 members as part of this network and of this practice groups. And if you wish, you could participate also in this exchange of information. It's a very safe platform to exchange information. This program that's called REDMA has 11 associate members, 6 full members, has produced 37 reports. So that's the website, the home website page of this website. Those who participate know this website, but you can check it there. Our collaboration with the International Medical Device Regulators, or the IMDRFs, we've participated in the meetings of different groups there, and you can see there some of the regulatory authorities that participate in these groups that are part of this IMDRF. And we also have a new group for clinical evidence for the in vitro diagnosis of medical devices that is also participating in the region. We also have other groups working on the topics that are considered as most important for the region. These are the groups that had already been created and the coordinators for each group. And we also have the IMDRF documents that are being translated into Portuguese and Spanish, some in Portuguese, but we already have 6 ready in Spanish, which are presented on the screen. And there are 12 additional documents that are being worked on for translation. And we also have 3 documents that are going to be produced in Portuguese. That's very important. So after this, then we're going to start with our topic, the main topic that they asked me to talk about, which are the documents that are related to the reliance processes, the best practices processes, as well as the good regulatory framework. And here I will start showing you the document of the WHO that was published last year with the 2 annexes and the documents which talk about the good reliance practices in the regulation, and the best practices. I'm going to start with the good regulatory practices annex, which is Annex 11, that has the purpose of present a high-level principles of good regulatory practices, send this to the member states so that they could prioritize all the regulatory functions. It's a very extensive scope, of all the regulatory networks and agencies and all the stakeholders that are related with regulatory topics should follow this as part of your objectives. You need to guarantee a solid and effective regulatory action to improve the quality, the making of decisions, to have more efficient and regulatory systems with better results, to promote the reliance. We're going to talk specifically about reliance. We need to facilitate international cooperation, the adoption of effective and efficient approaches, and to serve and protect public health. And this document is supplemented with other documents that talk about the good governance practices, the good reliance practices that I'm going to mention in a moment, the good review practices, and this as well as the quality management system for regulatory agencies. So this is how the document is presented. I mean, we're just mentioning a reference here, part of the document. And here we have some small changes, but basically the content that you have in the publication is the same as what we have here. There are just some minor changes. But this is a good illustration, a good show on how all the principles are working. You could see here on the slide the 9 principles, key principles for the best practices processes. They're all part of this. And we have political support, effective communication, a robust quality management system. We have decision-making processes that are based on science and evidence. So all of these are enablers, and you could see in the presentation, we have the regulatory framework, the different resources that we could have, the institutional framework that could help us with this process, creating products like inspection reports, regulatory decisions, improving the results by better complying with the regulatory requirements. And the main objective, which is the end objective, is to create an impact, to have a regulatory impact. Medical devices that are effective and of the best quality, that have a lower number of substandard type of devices, and to increase the contribution also to the earnings and the well-being of society. So this best overview of the document. And here, well, we have high-level principles that are practices that need to be adopted by all the responsible institutions that are involved in the regulatory aspects of medical products. And we include here all the work that is being done for the global benchmarking tool. There is a strong connection, as should be, with this. And here, the process of the global benchmarking tool, after so many years, we're managing to get to this incorporation of the different indicators of medical devices as part of the global assessment tool. This is going to be the GBT plus for medical devices. And as you all know, this has had an intense process of meetings, of discussions, and now we have the development of the guidelines and the indicators. And hopefully in the months to come, we're going to start in the WHO and the regional offices to start working on the pilot process for this tool, including all the indicators for medical devices. So these are the regulatory functions of this global benchmarking tool. The last thing that was in discussion, and that is part of the process, is including these 10 regulatory functions that are included here on the slide. And as you all know, as I mentioned, there is a work group that was created to integrate those indicators so as to discuss the new functions, what are the new indicators that should be generated, or which ones should be adapted to the indicators that are already existing in the tool. And so we need to agree on next steps. These are very intense discussions. I participated in many of these meetings, and I want to thank all the regulatory authorities that are here present. And many of them were here and participated very actively in this discussion. And as I mentioned, this is now in the final process of decision to develop the guidelines for each one of the indicators and the data sheets for each one of the indicators. This was a very long process, but we're on that process now. These are the most active members of this network. And I also want to congratulate my colleague that helped me with these slides. Newton shared or saw all the information of the meetings, the minutes of all the meetings to see who participated the most in here in these discussions, because the participation of the Americas is very important. These are the countries that have participated the most in the Americas region. And with those, we have 7 countries that are part of the Americas region. So there's a huge interest of the region on this topic, and there's an active participation on these discussions. Now, talking about reliance, before I go to the WHO document directly, I want to remind everybody that in the WHO, as mentioned in the document itself, is based on the OPS document that was published some years before. And that one talks about reliance, and the harmonization network for regulations. And this conceptual guideline was published on the principles regarding the use of regulatory decisions in other jurisdictions. And as I mentioned, those principles were used as the basis of the WHO document, that is Annex 10, that talks about a good best reliance practices in the regulation of medical products. And that talks about the newest technologies that is much more sophisticated, and we have much more globalization. And they propose to present strategies to challenge those or to work on those challenges, to have better collaboration, to use the technical resources and knowledge, to develop strategies that are consistent with best regulatory practices for all the systems. And the purpose is really to promote an efficient approach for regulation, specifically presented in general principles, and to give high-level guidance, definitions, and key concepts for the mechanisms and reliance activities. So these are talks about medical devices and includes all the regulatory functions that have been defined throughout the whole life cycle of the product. So that's very important. This is also designed for all the regulatory agencies and national regulatory agencies, regardless of the maturity level. This is another slide that we also extracted from the other document, and we can see some differences there. So we got this figure from there to show the process on how we're increasing gradually the reliance level in different topics. We go to independent decisions, to go to taking full advantage of the regulatory work, then to go to the sub-regional mechanisms and the regional mechanisms, and going to unilateral acknowledgement until we get to mutual acknowledgement. So this is how we're going to build this confidence or this trust system amongst all the regulatory agencies to increase the level of regulatory efficiency. So here we have the principles. We have the principle of universality. The countries are still making their own sovereign decisions. We also have the principle of transparency, of respecting the national or regional legal framework, the consistency and competition. These are the 6 main principles that are very important for the best reliance practices. And here we're going to the end of the presentation. And here we have the document in the global model regulatory framework for medical devices that recommends a gradual approach. It's not something that's going to change overnight. We need to have this gradual approach based on the resources that are available, on the things that we can have, and the strengthening of the regulatory system in different phases, with basic controls first and extended controls, with a regulatory system that is based on risk, with a regulatory reliance. And this document, as you know, was produced some years ago in 2017. And there is a work group that is following a very intense work schedule of all these activities that is continue talking about this. They started last year, and this year they're going to continue with these periodical meetings to update this document and so that in this year could be ready in the future, but this is something that's still current and that's still there, and we actually recommended to use it. We translate it into Spanish, and when we have the new one, we're also going to translate that one, and we're going to disseminate it. And we want to say that this is a very important process of seminars and documents. I'm not going to start with all of these details right now because we don't have enough time for that, but we could say that there's different phases for that process, from basic controls for all the application, before the marketing, the placement in the market, pre and post market, and also the extended controls and the applications in these three different phases, where this is being built. And this is something that we also took from the document. So in the 15 minutes that I had available, well, I know I spoke very quickly, but I wanted to present a general information on this document and the work that we have done to all the regulatory work in the Americas. And I wanted to thank all the regulatory authorities that are represented in this group that have already collaborated in all of these activities. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. Great overview on the principles for best practices and processes for regulatory systems, reliance mechanisms, and good regulatory practices. Also, good that you provided the activities that have been going on in the region. We're looking forward to the April meeting. I'm sure a lot of the regulators that are present today are looking forward to that as well. Thank you. I just wanted to take an opportunity before introducing the next speaker to remind everyone, feel free to put any questions in the question and answer box. We do have some time at the end to go through those questions, but you don't have to wait until that part of the webinar to put the question. So feel free to do that. Moving on to the next next topic, legal obligations applicable to medical device NRAs. I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Devin McDaniels. He serves as the Economic Affairs Officer in the Trade and Environment Division of the World Trade Organization since 2011. He's the Deputy Secretary of the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. He advises WTO member governments on issues at the intersection of standards, regulation, and trade. He holds degrees in economics, international relations, and environmental policy from the University of British Columbia and the University of Oxford. Welcome, Devin, and the floor is yours. Feel free to share your screen.
Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. Good afternoon for that very kind welcome. And I'm so glad to be here and to share with you a little bit about the WTO work in this space and how our agreements may be relevant and important for national regulatory authorities when dealing with medical devices. So I'm just going to share my screen now. And I trust that you can see it now. So I really want to, in my presentation, share three key points, three key messages. So the first one is really carrying on from what our colleague from PAHO just talked about in terms of regulatory reliance and good regulatory practice, and to broaden this out to really make the point that trade and regulatory cooperation together are absolutely vital for access to essential medical products and innovative medical products and medical devices. So these really need to work together, and they're very powerful and important when they work together. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is some of the core obligations that exist in the WTO agreement on technical barriers to trade. And that is the agreement that deals with standards and regulations. And I'm going to talk about three obligations in that agreement, which I think are of particular relevance to NRAs. And so those are about the use of international standards. Second, about how the agreement talks about facilitating conformity assessment procedures, all the registration, certification procedures. And then finally, the importance of transparency and the notification process that's created by the WTO TBT agreement. And the last point I'm going to talk about is the role of the Tbt Committee. That's the WTO body where regulators and trade officials get together to talk about issues in the relationship between standards regulations. And this is an important place to help find cooperative solutions to these types of bottlenecks that can arise, including in the area of medical devices. When we look at regulatory cooperation and regulatory reliance, I think from the trade point of view as well, there's a really important element, which is that both of these types of cooperative efforts, work sharing, relying on other regulators is really powerful because it helps to avoid duplication and actually leads to more efficient use of resources, both for regulators and manufacturers. And when this cooperation works well, and when this regulatory reliance works well, it means that you have less differences in regulation between countries. And that actually has benefits both for health and for trade. So for instance, this can expedite the registration of a new medical device or a vaccine or whatever product, which has immediate health benefits for patients. And at the same time, this type of cooperation also can facilitate the operation of supply chains and enable manufacturers to better meet the demands of different markets in an efficient way. I think this type of cooperation and reliance in these types of mechanisms are especially important for those NRAs which may have less capacity and less resources, especially when they have to deal with the fact that medical devices now increasingly embed more and more complex technologies and information technology, Internet of Things. All of these developments mean that this cooperation is more and more important than ever. Overall, when we talk about this type of cooperation and regulatory reliance, and this is something also that our colleague from PAHO just mentioned, strengthening the use of good regulatory practices is really actually a foundation of making this cooperation take place, enabling it to happen. So these include things like transparency, public consultation, internal coordination between different agencies and ministries of the government. And so these are very important tools for enabling regulatory reliance and cooperation to work effectively. So coming to some of these three core obligations of the WTO agreement and the TBT agreement, and I guess you may be familiar in particular on this one on international standards, but it bears repeating the importance of the use of international standards and how international standards are an extremely powerful tool when they are actually used by NRAs, by regulators, as the basis for your own domestic requirements, your own national standards, or your own national regulations. When you rely on the work that's done in the international standardizing bodies, not only are you borrowing from the state of the art and actually being more efficient in how you regulate, but also at the same time you're enabling trade to flow more smoothly and facilitate trade. And that's actually what at its core the TBT agreement is really about, promoting the use of international standards and promoting regulatory convergence and alignment on the basis of those standards. And I think it goes without saying, but I mean, clearly, if every country has its own requirements, its own standards, it's impossible to trade across borders. It becomes very expensive, and that then has very negative impacts for health outcomes, for patients' access to essential medical products in terms of time to market, cost, etc. So there's a really powerful connection that exists between international trade and using international standards to achieve those regulatory objectives in each country. The obligation itself in the agreement is really as a general rule, WTO members are required to use relevant international standards as the basis for the technical regulations. So these are, specifications for products, so specifications for, let's say, medical devices, as well as for their conformity assessment procedures. So these are all the registration, approval, all those types of authorization procedures. So the relevant international standard should be used as a basis for both of those, as well as for national standards, voluntary standards that may be adopted in different countries. And that's the general rule. However, of course, there is the recognition that in some cases, international standards may not be appropriate for every country and for every situation and every policy objective. So in those types of situations where there are sort of fundamental technological problems or geographical problems, then members have additional flexibility. But the general rule is that using international standards is very important and beneficial from the point of view of trade. The second obligation that I just want to mention in a little bit less detail is on what's called conformity assessment procedures. And as I was just saying, these are the procedures that you would be more familiar with terms like registration, approval, authorization. In the TBT agreement, there is an encouragement actually for members to use, first of all, international and regional systems for conformity assessment. And these, some of these were already mentioned earlier on. For example, in the context of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, you have the single audit program, for example. That's an example of a system for conformity assessment. So that type of system is encouraged to be used under the agreement. Also, there is a strong, there are obligations about actually recognizing and accepting the conformity assessment results. So those are the tests, the certificates, the reports that come from another country as the basis for your own assessment. So that means that you can avoid having to redo, manufacturers don't have to redo tests and certification, and regulators, it becomes easier for regulators to actually assess and be efficient in dealing with submissions. And this is, again, very much in line with what we were talking about and what our colleague mentioned earlier from PAHO about regulatory reliance. Indeed, these are examples of forms of regulatory reliance and cooperation, including more formal examples like recognition arrangements, mutual recognition arrangements, which can also exist. Moving on to the third core obligation that I wanted to mention, and that is about transparency. Now, transparency in the context of course, international trade. Here we're talking about regulatory transparency, making known the changes in requirements that a country is going to impose, and creating opportunities for public consultation, receiving comments on draft laws and regulations. The TBT agreement of the WTO has a specific system, a notification process that is created by that agreement. And that's about providing advance notice to all the other members of the WTO about changes in your technical regulations or your certification approval procedures. And so when in situations where a WTO member is adopting a new or changed regulation or conformity assessment procedure, and it's not in line or it's not harmonized with relevant international standards, and it may have a significant effect on trade, then that triggers the obligation to actually notify. So to inform other WTO members about that change in regulation, and also provide the opportunity for comment. So usually that means at least 60 days for other members and stakeholders to share comments with you as the member that's going to impose a new regulation. And that can be very valuable because you can learn about from other countries, from other perspectives about potential challenges that may arise in complying with your regulation. And that can actually help to improve overall the quality and enforcement of ultimately of the regulation that you adopt. If we look at regulations, if we look at what's been notified to the WTO each year in respect of medical devices, we see that since 2020, there has been, well, at least especially in 2020, there was a big increase in notifications related to medical devices. And you can see that part of this is actually to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. There were a number of new changed regulations that were introduced and notified. Also in 2021, we see that there was, again, a high number of notifications on medical devices. If we look in the Americas region itself, Brazil and the United States are the two WTO members that have notified the most regulations about medical devices. And you can also see some others there, like Canada, Peru, Ecuador, Mexico, and others as well, who have notified quite a few different regulations to the WTO. Just to give you some examples, what are these notifications about? So for instance, last year, Peru notified guidelines for the manufacture of reusable cloth face masks, protective masks that were just for use by the general population. So that was a new requirement that was introduced, and that was notified to the WTO. Another example is Mexico notifying minimum requirements and different criteria related to the classification of medical devices in terms of their risk. A third example of a notification to the WTO was Brazil actually notifying that it was on a temporary basis in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, accepting information from other regulators that participate in PICS and in the medical device single audit program as the basis for its own assessment of medical devices and pharmaceuticals. In place of actually conducting its own inspections of those manufacturing facilities. So then turning to my final point, which is about how the work of the WTO contributes in a sort of more active way. So we have, this is a picture of a meeting of the Tbt Committee before the pandemic. Hopefully we'll get back to something like this again, where we actually meet in person. But this is a forum where governments come together, where members come together with their trade officials and regulators to sort out problems that can arise from different regulatory approaches that are taken and try to find practical solutions to those issues. So in the committee, we have really two tracks of work. And the one that I'm focusing on is the first one, which is these specific trade concerns to discuss in the committee to try to find solutions. Usually those are based on what's been actually notified, because that's the first way that other countries and other members are informed about these changes in regulations. Just to give you some examples, we have a meeting next week of the committee, and there are several different medical device related regulations that will be on the agenda. Two of them are just here on the screen to show you. For instance, the EU medical device regulation and in vitro diagnostic medical devices regulation, it will be on the agenda. And this has been raised at a number of different meetings since 2019. And members like Canada, China, Japan, Korea, Mexico, Singapore, and the US have raised concerns, for example, about the insufficient number of notified bodies. So those are the bodies that can perform conformity assessment, and also about the lack of implementing acts and guidance that is needed for compliance with this changed medical device regulation in the EU. Another one of these trade concerns is, for instance, China's registration fees for drugs and medical devices, where we have a number of members also raising since 2015 concerns about lack of equal treatment between imported and domestic producers in terms of registration fees related to foreign inspection. So these are the types of issues that are discussed and come up in the work of the WTO Tbt Committee. Just to wrap up and to summarize, so again, I think to emphasize the point that was made in the previous presentation, regulatory cooperation and reliance together with trade are really vital for access to essential medical products and medical devices. And here, things like good regulatory practice are really important for allowing that cooperation to take place. Some of the core TBT obligations that are especially relevant, I think, for national regulatory authorities include the requirement to align with international standards, to facilitate conformity assessment, and also to be transparent and notify changes in regulations that may have an effect on trade. And finally, the forum that's created by the WTO in the Tbt Committee can be a useful place to actually find solutions to problems that can arise when there are different approaches taken. So I think I'll stop there and perhaps hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Devin, for sharing that, the work of the committee and an overview of, and also the benefit that we just mentioned. And also we heard from Paho of the benefits of regulatory reliance, the importance of cooperation, and also how that impacts trade. Really good information. Thank you for that. Now I will introduce our next speaker, Renata Amaral. Renata is an experienced international trade lawyer with an extensive and proven record of successful engagement at the WTO, bilateral and regional trade negotiations, domestic trade policy, and market access. Over the course of her 15-year career, has advised governments and private stakeholders on international trade matters with a focus on WTO law. She currently serves as a visiting scholar and adjunct professor at the American University Washington College of Law, where she co-directs the certificate program on WTO and US trade law and policy. Dr. Amaral is the Trade and Good Regulatory Practices staff lead of the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence of the Medical Device Sector. She's also vice chair of the ABCI Institute, a nonprofit organization of international trade scholars headquarters in Washington, DC, and the founder of Women Inside Trade, a nonprofit international organization that aims to contribute to the empowerment of women through its global network of professionals, specialized training and leadership development. Thank you for being with us today, Renata, and feel free to share the screen. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Presentation mode. Okay. So I'm gonna be very fast. Actually, I really appreciated Devin's and Alexandre's presentation. Thank you so much on behalf of the coalition again. I will basically wrap up what both said and complement a little bit in 5 minutes, hopefully. Before I do, I think just commenting on Devin's last slide or two last slides, I think it's very important. I don't know if it's clear to everyone how important it is to see the notifications to the Tbt Committee as an opportunity for the international community to participate and to be more vocal in the process of new regulations that countries are submitting. And in this, I'm referring not only to government's responsibilities, but also private sector and the importance of participating of the process. So just a short comment on that before I begin with my presentation. So I have very few slides. I don't want to repeat what was mentioned before. But basically, just comment if some of you are lost. When we talk about good regulatory practice, we are really not talking about creating anything new, any new regulation or standards. We are talking about facilitating better outcomes within the domestic territories, right, of the countries. So good regulatory practices, they basically create a professional process of a rule-making process for regulations within the domestic environment. Of course, it's very important that this process is transparent and that it allows for participation of private sector stakeholders, academic, government stakeholders, and also that the whole process is and decision-making process is made based on evidence. The good regulatory practices are important first step, I would say, to international regulatory cooperation. And Devin mentioned a little bit about regulatory cooperation. We are not talking about making every country's regulation the same, but we are talking about cooperation and talks between countries to align their regulations towards a better international cooperation. And maybe then in a second step, we talk about regulatory convergence. Okay, so what are the basic components that we at the coalition understand as very important for good regulatory practice? So the issuance of a regulatory forecast, have a national regulatory register, provide opportunity for public comment, public consultations, publish evidence and conduct regulatory analysis, respond to stakeholder input, use quality data and sound science, employ risk-based approaches, good regulatory impact assessments, conduct pro-competitive analysis, access the international impact of a regulation, use international standards as a basis for national regulations, conduct ex-post assessment of regulatory impacts, establish a central regulatory coordination body. I know it's a lot, and we could talk about each one of these items for a long time. Most of these items were already in Alexandre's presentations. Actually, they were addressed. Some of the elements, components of GRP that are here. Also, Devin. Here we included, and you're going to have access to this presentation. I'm trying to be fast just on the interest of time, but this is the basic regulatory life cycle of regulation, right? It can have more steps, and most of the times it has, but we have this basically regulatory life cycle as a standard, let's say like this for us. So the identification and set the objectives for new regulation, gather data and stakeholder input, public consultation, design the regulation, implement the regulation, and access regulatory impact of the implemented regulation. Trying here just to bring together what Alexandre and Devin just included in their presentation, we try at the coalition, and it's basically my role at the coalition, try to bring the conversation on good regulatory practice and international trade together. So GRPs encompassing the use of regulatory impact assessments, stakeholder engagement, and ex-post evaluation are critical tools in the hands of governments to ensure that regulation achieves its objectives. Again, it's not a tool to create new regulations. Over the past several years, attention has grown for the trade costs of regulatory divergence, of countries adopting different regulatory regulations for same product, for example, and therefore creating divergence and creating more trade costs to international trade. And I included here, just to finalize, 3 slides with OECD guidelines. Everything that I'm mentioning from now on is available at the Inter-American Coalition website, and the links are on the bottom of the page. So the OECD, the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, establishes several international benchmark documents regarding GRP. It's very important that we have those guidelines in mind. As governments, when we decide to adopt GRPs and review our internal GRPs processes. Here we have the World Health Organization documents that Alexandre already mentioned. Some of the documents, they are all also in the coalition website, and we have specific documents from the World Health Organization for the medical devices sector that are really, really important in the process of GRPs for the sector. And my last slide is just, I brought a few examples of international trade agreements that matter for this public, and that have already a chapter either on good regulatory practice, on regulatory improvement, or regulatory coherence. So the agreement between United States, Mexico, and Canada, chapter 28. The Pacific Alliance has a chapter on regulatory improvement, and the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership has a chapter on regulatory coherence as well. All the links are in the bottom of the page. I'll stop here because I know we have another presenter, and I'm here for questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata. Thank you for providing that overview of the good regulatory practices and how critical they are as it relates to trade. Really good information. I would like to introduce now the next speaker. Corey Aguino will be talking about international standards, development, adoption, and use by stakeholders, including regulatory authorities. Corey is specialized in standardization, conformity assessment, and international negotiations. Currently is executive secretary of the Pan American Standards Commission. She served as the executive director of the Bolivian Institute of Standardization and Quality, and has participated as national negotiator in several international and regional agreements in subjects related to technical barrier to trade. Previously, she served at the Ministry of Industry as the coordinator of the Bolivian Quality Infrastructure System, organizing the accreditation body and the Metrology Institute, among other tasks. She's also a co-author of the book Conformity Assessment System in Bolivia. Thank you, Corey, for joining us today. Feel free to share the screen, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Vesa, for this introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to switch to Spanish. My presentations are in English, so it could facilitate the interpretation. Muy buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you for this invitation and for inviting me to make this presentation regarding the adoption of international standards. As we've seen in the prior presentations, we've seen how important it is to use international standards, and when we want to establish technical regulations. And so that is why it's so important to introduce what standardization is, how it is done, and what are the international, regional, and national organizations that are related to this activity. Now, standardization is defined both in the OTC agreement that they just mentioned, the WTO, as well as in the Guide 2 of the ISO and IAC, which are the normal standardization organizations that say that it consists on developing standards that are documents established by consensus and that are approved by a recognized organization, which provides in this document rules for common and repeated uses, guidelines or characteristics for activities and their results, and
sirve para lograr óptimos.
It also helps us to achieve optimal results in a given context. So standards are used every day. Even if we don't know about them, we have standards for many sectors, or for all the sectors. Almost all the sectors and products have standards. And They are used by entrepreneurs, commerce people, public organizations or public bodies and other type of organizations to help with certain issues with trade, regulation, quality, health and safety, new technologies, energy efficiency, environmental impact, connectivity, interoperability, among many others. So standards have an influence on our everyday life, on the everyday life of each citizen. As I said, there's different type of standards that can help us define or fill out or cover the needs of the different actors that I just mentioned.
Las características de las normas, esto es muy
The
importante.
characteristics of standards, well, this is very important and this is very well defined in the OTC agreement of the WTO. That means, which says that they are voluntary. Technical standards are voluntary and they are defined by market needs and associations. They have to be based on a consensus and they have to be approved by recognized entity at an international level. These organizations have been recognized also by their own governments. There are regional standardization organizations that group the national regulatory organizations, and we also have international standardization organizations that include national and regional standardization organizations. They can all be part of these international organizations. Now, these presentations have been facilitated, have been presented, and I'm sure that you're going to get them. So I'm not going to go into detail about everything that we have here. So the benefits of standards are multiple. We've mentioned some of them, but for society, for companies, for all stakeholders, they have here some of the benefits that they can obtain. But basically, what standards want to achieve is to protect health, protect the environment, protect biodiversity, to provide us with tools so as to verify the quality and the safeness of products and services. There's different types of standards to achieve this. There are standards regarding dimensions that will talk about paper formats, classification systems, etc. We have performance standards that talk about energy performance, ergonomics, noise performance. We have methods and testing standards for chemical assays or non-destructive assays or all type of test schemes to verify compliance with the requirements of other standards or other regulations. There's also management system standards. The one that we know the most is ISO 9001, which is a quality management system. But we also have risk management systems, energy related systems, environmental management systems, etc. We have symbol standards also, terminology standards to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing in the same language whenever we work on a specific topic. There are specific standards for products, and there are others that are called the basic standards, like the standard established by the International Units System. In this chart, we're not going to go into detail, but right here, we only have here the scope of each type of standard and what its effect and financial value for these different type of parts. I thought it was also important to say and to do this introduction on what is understood as a national quality infrastructure or system and how it should be formed. This is quite related to what we've heard about regarding requirements and the needs of the OTC requirements that the WTO has. Now, as an organization that is directly related with the quality and standards, well, we consider that the main core is established by the National Standards Body, the National Metrology Institute, and the National Accreditation Body. These are the ones that are going to accompany us in all the processes of conformity assessment, to approve national standards, or to approve in international groups representing the country for the development of international standards or their adoption, and to also make sure that all the measurements follow international patterns. Now, these national bodies are going to be related or are going to provide service to national testing laboratories, calibration laboratories of all the measurement equipment, and to all the bodies that provide certification or inspection at a national level. And they also provide service or cover the governance bodies that are related to regulations, and they use as a base everything that is already being worked on with the quality infrastructure or bodies. Then we have also business chambers, consumer federations, or the academic sector. And then who are benefited from all of these services? Well, consumers and the companies throughout the country, you know, importers, exporters, and foreign investors or international organizations. I know that this slide is quite complex, and I don't want to detail all of this, but I wanted to mention how is it that this national quality infrastructure should be formed. On this right-hand side, we have all the national production chain, everything that requires all of this input to work with, and to work with it and to follow through with everything that is happening at the international level, and to provide it at a national level, giving it all the services at the national level. As I said, we need to have a national metrology institute that's going to help us with all the calibration and with metrology at a nationwide. It's going to support the laboratories, and for that, we also need a standardization organization or body and a certification or accreditation body. And as you can see, the work of each one of these organizations is connected to one another, and each one requires the input and the work of the other one. So when we talk about standardization, which is the topic that we want to talk about right now, standardization is going to be standards that are going to be used when certifying or giving this accreditation, and the accreditors are going to need those standards to verify the technical competence of all the certification bodies and the laboratories using standards once again. And they are also going to use standards so that they can certify products, systems, staff, and for the laboratories to use all the test, their assay methods that are certified and validated. And the regulators that we've seen have to use the international standards. And if there's no international standard, they have to use their national standards for their technical regulations. So they also have to be connected to the standardization body. And internationally, we also need the participation and representation of all of these in the corresponding forums. For example, for accreditation, we have the International Accreditation Forum, the IAF, and the ILAC, which is the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation or Collaboration for all laboratories. And regionally, we have the IAAC, which is the Inter-American Accreditation Cooperation bodies. At the metrology, we have the BIPM that keeps all the international patterns of the measures internationally. We have the OIML, the Legal Metrology International Organization, that is also quite related to all the topics that have to do with measures and measurements. And here at the regional level, we have the Inter-American metrology system that groups all the national metrology systems. Regarding standardization, internationally speaking, we have ISO, IEC. ISO is International Standards Organization. The IEC is the International Electrotechnical Collaboration that works on developing the standards for electrotechnical aspects. We have the ITU that has to do with telecommunications, codex for food-related issues. And in our region, we also have an organization which I represent, which is the Pan American Commission of Technical Standards that groups all the national and international standards bodies in the region. This is just to give you a quick view of how a national quality infrastructure should be developed or how it should work. And this one talks specifically about standardization and regulations at an international level. So here we have all the bodies at the international and regional level that we have in our region for the national standards body that's going to work through technical committees to develop the national standards or to make the decision and adopt international or regional standards as per each case. And all of these are voluntary. Thus, all the ministries or the entities that have a mandate of developing all the technical regulations in the country need to verify that there are international or national standards for the development of the technical regulations that are compulsory. Now, the technical regulations can be issued because of health topics, security topics, environmental topics, or consumer protection topics. And these are going to be directly applicable at a national level and also for imports and exports. And these entities that need to regulate or that are in charge of regulations have to be in contact with all the focal points of the OTC or the TBT's agreements of the barriers to trade of the WTO so that they can also send all the concerns and comments to the WTO and to be able to get some feedback and to send all the responses to any comments that they've received regarding the notifications of the technical regulatory drafts. Also, these bodies need to confirm the good conduct code for technical regulations development, which is Agreement 3 of the WTO agreement, and they also need to publish their standardization annual plans and to present the use of technical regulations to their availability, make them available to everybody. Each national, regional, or international standards bodies has their own policies for the documents and property rights, and they also establish certain costs for selling the documents. So at a national level, there are several agreements or contracts, that the national standards body develops to see how these standards are going to be used in a technical regulation that is public document, that is a public document. Now, to talk a little bit about the international standardization bodies, we're going to take as an example the ISO, which at the end of the day is the organization that is most relevant because of all the different sectors that it covers and regulates. It is an organization that was founded in 1947. It's a private organization. It's non-governmental. It is an independent body, but it's not an organization. It's an NGO, basically. It's not a company organization. It has a work area or a global work capacity because it has around 167 members. The members of an international standards organization would be the national or standards organization of each country. So we have 167 countries represented in ISO. And to date, there are 24,000 international standards, 24,000 or plus standards at a rhythm of 135 new standards developed each month. There are more than 100,000 experts involved in the development process of all standards. And to date, there are 803 technical committees and subcommittees active as part of the ISO. There is a rhythm of approximately 30 meetings of the committees, subcommittees, work groups, or ad hoc groups created, or technical groups of the ISO, which meets every day. And right now they are meeting virtually because of the pandemic. And until now and until we get some new information, all the meetings are being done virtually. This also facilitates the participation of the developing countries in all of these technical committees because they are not, they don't have to cover any travel expenses or transportation expenses of their delegates, so that they work with these virtually very well. Now, these are all of the ISO state members. There's 167, as I said, and there are different categories of membership. We're not going to go into detail into this, but you can see how the region is represented in ISO. Now, technical sectors where they've been working on a lot more with the ISO is, as you can see here, we have information technology, graphics and photography, mechanical engineering, transportation on metallic materials. But as you can see, 6.8% of all the work that the ISO is doing has to do with health, medicine, and laboratory equipment. So an international standard really represents what the global consensus is in the state of the art, at the state of the issues of a specific subject matter, which is being, for which the standard is being created. That is why it's really important to participate in the standardization process. Now, how can we participate? Well, each country, as I mentioned, has their own regulatory organization and standardization organization, which is also a member of the ISO. That member is going to decide if they're going to participate in developing a specific committee for ISO. And for that, they're going to create a mirror national committee. These committees have to have all the sectors involved, all the stakeholders involved, government, industry, trade, consumers, everybody has to be involved in them, including academia or even the worker sectors. They should all be represented, and they all have the same possibility of voting and making comments of voice and vote in this national committee so that they can work in the national position of a document that has been worked on internationally speaking. And even the national standardization body can send their own experts whenever the first drafts of the document is being worked on, or when they are part of the committee or working in a committee, in a subcommittee, so that they can participate and they can bring all their expertise to the committee. That is why it's very important for national standardization bodies to get the support of experts internationally, nationally speaking, because it is possible to have an expert of all the subject matters, but to contact the necessary experts, and so that, and to have all the stakeholders involved in this. We also need to consider that in ISO and IEC, there is one country, one vote. So when the standards are being developed, all the countries have the same level of representation to decide if this regulatory document is approved or not. That is why it is important to be part of the standards development organization. Here, I leave the information about the COPANT, which is the organization I represent, the Pan-American organization. We currently have 31 active members in the region. As you can see, all the members are mentioned here. They are part of all the different regions, and we also have some additional members adherent members, especially from Europe, that are interested in finding out what is happening in our region regarding standardization, or that in many cases, they give us a lot of collaboration and cooperation and help us with these things. We are also coordinated with the International Metrology System and the IAAC, and with all the regional organizations, we've created a council for working on the quality in the Americas, so that we are always in agreement and working on the development of the region and working on the development of all of those organizations or bodies that are not that strengthened or that are not that well developed in our region. Here at the COPANT, we rarely develop a technical Pan-American regulation. We do this whenever we do not have an international regulation in case just of that need. Right now, we are just working with one technical committee regarding labeling for energy efficiency of household appliances. And what we basically do is, what we normally do is support all of our members so that they have full capacity of participating in the development of international standards. And we also promote the adoption of international standards whenever possible. They also asked me to talk about the adoption and how this adoption is done. So the ISO has a guideline called 21 Part 1 that talks about the adoption of international standards. If you wish to have access to the documents, the ISO document, they should contact the standard national body of your country to ask for this standard so that you can receive it. So the scope of this guideline is to determine the level of correspondence between the regional or national standards and the relevant international standard. How do we work with a different adoption, or how do we adopt the international standards? How do we indicate any type of technical deviation that could exist when the adoption is happening, and how to recognize all of these deviations, how to number also these standards if they are identical adoptions of international standards, for example, as well as what is the level of correspondence between the national standard and the international standard. An identical adoption of an international standard occurs when the standard is fully adopted with all its technical content, all its structure, and the drafting of the same. And obviously, we do accept that our translations accepted. We need to remember that the official language of ISO are Spanish, Russian, and French. Spanish is not part of the official language. However, the COPANT and the UNE in Spain have made sure or achieved the ISO approval on a work group that is translating the standards into Spanish, which is connected to the UNE in Spain. And when these groups work and translate any of the standards, it would go to the technical management board of the ISO, and if approved, it is then published as an official ISO translated standard. Right now, there are not a lot of these official ISO standards translated into Spanish, but the members of our region and of UNE in Spain are working on translating the standards whenever there's a need to adopt them, so that we can prevent doubling efforts. At the COPANT level, we've created a tool where the members can find out if any other member has already translated any international standard into Spanish, if they're interested in that one. And so that's the type of reciprocity that we have amongst all the standardization organizations, so that we can share also the work of these translations. So yes, the translation is allowed for, and there might be some minimal editorial changes allowed. And to identify that is an identical adoption of the same, they use the words IDT. Now, there might be some modifications during the adoption, when there's a deviation that has to be clearly identified and explained, because maybe the adopted standard has to keep its own structure. So the changes are limited to the structure, but there has to be a very easy comparison made between the original standard and the modifications done. An example is to provide an alternate choice or option if there is some sort of requirement, additional requirement based on what we have in the international standards. If that is the case, then you use the code MOD, which means it's a modification. In order to publish an adopted standard, the national standardization body can include a foreword or an introduction indicating that it is an adoption and the type of adoption that it was, if there was some modifications made or not, or if it's a translation, if there are different types of or that may have, I don't know, the cover page that is different and it's different to the one that the normally ISO has for that standard. It might have some amendments or editorial changes. All changes must be indicated.
May I just jump in? Just wanted to let you know we're already over time, and if you could wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, just solo para terminar, entonces.
So then to wrap this up, everything that has to be included in the publication and how we have to number these standards that are adopted. We have these two options that are allowed for. And so I'll leave you some examples and thank you very much for this attention. And so I'm ready for any question you might have.
Thank you very much. A lot of great information
Muchas
shared.
gracias. Muy buena información. Perdón.
I can see that we now we're moving to the question and answer session. I know that during the presentations, we already had an opportunity to receive a lot of the questions, and I see that the speakers went ahead and answered those questions. For those of you that would like to know what the questions are, you can view them in the answer portion of the box. I would like to read one question that I saw come through in the chat. At this point, if possible, I would like to invite the speakers as well to turn on the cameras to answer some of the questions that are pending. One of the questions that came in the chat box is directed to Devin and Renata. The question is, what if the international SDOs don't deliver the desired material? How can WTO and Nras contribute to the process, preferably early on?
Devin, would you like to go?
Yes, sure. Thanks for the question. I mean, very briefly to say that I think it should be clear to everyone that the WTO does not have the role of developing technical standards. That's not the role of WTO at all. So in this context, it can be a place where members can bring attention to this gap, to this issue, the lack of a standard, for example, or the need to develop new standards. And that's what one of the functions of the WTO system, to have that kind of discussion. And this can then contribute by actually then encouraging the standards organizations to help fill that gap. So that can be one way that can be supported.
Thank you, Devin. Renata, would you like to add to that, or?
No, I think Devin answered, and one confusion that I feel within the coalition members a few times is exactly the answer that Devin gave, like the WTO doesn't create standards, and also it's an organization where countries have the right to talk, for example, in the Tbt Committee. So if the private sector has concerns with regards to a regulation, it has to, the better way to address than if they want to go to the WTO context, is to talk to their own inquiry points in their countries, and then coordinate with the government to have a voice at a Tbt committee, for example. But that's all.
Thank you very much. I would like at this point to also invite Patty Pineda, to a colleague of mine, to join us and just to help with the questions in Spanish. Patty, if you would like to also unmute. While Patty's getting ready there, I'm just looking at some of the questions that are already answered. And again, if you have trouble viewing them, let us know, and we can provide some input, but we're already over time. And so we would like to focus on right now the questions that are pending. Patty, would you like to read one of the open questions?
Yeah, sure. So the first question says, the technology innovation in medical devices, the benefits, the public health is very valuable and important for the global population. Is there a policy for global alignment or an international standard for the management of cross-border wastes when the medical devices expire? In the case of this kind of standard or policy exists, who is the one that's going to take the responsibility of handling and disposing all those wastes generated in order to mitigate the environmental impact? This question is not addressed to a specific speaker, so I guess it's open. If there is
Do we have anyone that wants to take this or comment on the question?
Yeah, maybe I can do. I'm not an expert on this subject, but I can send you some information of ISO about technical committees that are working on standards on medical devices. But I'm not sure if there's one standard on waste on medical devices. Maybe there is. The responsibility of implementing or adopting a standard is, well, to adopt the international standard is from the national standard body, who has to define if the standard is important for the country, and there's enough stakeholders to be involved in the study of that document and to be adopted. But again, this will be a voluntary document in the country. If someone wants to make it compulsory, it has to be an authority to make it compulsory, so a technical regulation based on the document. And then the authority who's going to make it compulsory has to make sure that in the country there's enough conformity assessment bodies to make sure who's going to confirm that the technical regulation is being comply. So you need laboratories, you need certification bodies or inspection bodies that are accredited to make sure that they have the competence to do this job. I don't know if someone wants to jump and add something to that.
Thank you, Corey. I think that was good. The next set of panelists, I know they have some technical expertise, and maybe we can try to take this question in the next panel as well. Thank you for that.
Y la última pregunta es para la
And the final question is for Dr. Eguino, who speaks Spanish, so I'll read it in Spanish. And it says, how can we consult INCOPACT if there is an international standard that is translated into Spanish? Through the National standardization or entity of each country, the database that we have that is shared by the members on the documents, the regulations that are published and the language they're in, this is found at a website that's a closed portal for COPANT members. So through their own national NRAs, they can consult whether that standard has already been adopted in the country, has been translated by some other regulatory authority now in the region. If we don't have that information in our database, sometimes we also consult with the members and ask them, is there, perhaps it was not included somehow, and that's how we proceed.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the speakers for participating and providing very helpful information today. I think that is all the questions that we had pending. With that, I think we can conclude this part of the session. Again, just a reminder, there were additional questions that were already answered in the question and answer box by our speakers today. Thank you again for participating. At this time, I think we are ready to start the next session. May I have Stephen, invite Stephen to take over. Thank you very much.
Lisa, thank you very much. And before Stephen gets started, I'd like to briefly introduce him. Stephen Vibes is the Vice President for Global Strategy and Analysis at the Advanced Medical Technology Association. He is responsible for AdvaMed's work in Latin America, Africa, and also with good regulatory practices, international standards, and technical barriers to trade. Stephen, thank you very much for moderating this next session.
Thank you, Sandra. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to all the speakers on our last panel, very informative. And I would just like to say that AdvaMed is a founding member of the coalition. We lead the implementation of the COVID-19 medical device regulatory convergence project, which is a cooperative effort between the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, the American National Standards Institute, and the Inter-American Coalition, working with regulatory authorities and stakeholders across the Americas. It's glad to be able to be with you today, and an honor to moderate this panel. At this time, I invite all of our speakers for this panel that are with us to turn on their video, but with audio off, just to give the virtual audience a visual of this session. As I wrap up the introduction, or if you experience some internet lag, I will ask you to turn off your video and audio with the exception of the presenter. Regulatory convergence for the medical technology sector is the mission of the Inter-American Coalition, comprised of the medical technology industry of the Western Hemisphere, working together with the standards developing organizations and working in conjunction and collaboration with all stakeholders, including medical device regulatory authorities. And the central pillar of our collective regulatory convergence work in this sector is international standards. And here we have the beginnings of a good story to tell. We just heard from Alexandre Lemberger at PAHO how the World Health Organization has guidance for national regulatory authorities on medical device regulatory frameworks, good regulatory practices, and the principles of regulatory reliance and recognition. The use of international standards for medical technologies is central to implementing and operationalizing this WHO guidance. We also heard from Renata Amaral on new global benchmarks for foundational good regulatory practices as they apply to all sectors, including health and beyond. And we heard from Devin McDaniels at the World Trade Organization how the 164 members of the World Trade Organization have international treaty and derivative legal obligations regarding the regulatory process for medical devices. And this includes the requirement for national regulatory authorities to use relevant standards as a basis for national technical regulations. Mr. McDaniels also mentioned the legal requirement for regulatory authorities to notify their draft and final technical regulations to the WTO, allowing for a minimum 60-day global public consultation, and ideally prior to the finalization of the measure. We also heard from COPANT on the role of standards developing organizations such as ISO and IEC, among others. But how exactly do these and other SDOs develop and maintain the international standards for medical technologies? It's easy to think that international standardization is something that other people over there in Geneva do, that we in our own capacities do not have access to. To the contrary, international standardization is a bottom-up activity that depends upon the participation of all stakeholders around the world, participation from industry, from regulatory authorities, from users, exporters, importers, and all affected stakeholders. But where and how exactly does the international standards process work for MedTech? That is what we'll examine on our panel here today. I will save the individual introductions for each speaker as we go, but I did wish now at the onset to introduce some of the institutions represented on this panel and their associated acronyms. We've talked already about the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and the International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEC. We will explore their specific work on medical technologies. We will also hear from several other standards developing organizations in the medical technology space whose work goes to support or otherwise complement that of the ISO and IEC. So institutionally, we will hear from representatives of the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, AAMI, AMI, the Clinical Laboratory and Standards Institute, CLSI, the Medical Imaging Technology Alliance, MITA, and ASTM International. And our primary objective of this panel is to both share information on how this technical activity works, but also to increase your engagement in it, be you a regulatory authority, in industry, or other stakeholder. Dr. Kavanaugh will also speak about the other important reference documents of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, the IMDRF, which in its essential principles provides guidance to national regulatory authorities on the use of standards. So with that, I'd like to transition now to the first portion of this panel on ISO, turning first to Peter Linders and Veronica Viscovich. Peter Linders is the Director of Development of International Standards and Regulations at Philips Healthcare. He's the chair of the European CEN-CENELEC Advisory Board for Healthcare Standards, ABHS, CENELEC Technical Committee 62, and chair of the Technical and Regulatory Affairs Committee at COSIR, which is the European Trade Association representing the medical imaging, radiotherapy, health, ICT, and electromedical industries. Veronica Viscovich is the technical coordinator at the Food and Health Department at IRAM, the Argentinian Institute of Standardization and Certification. She is a chemical engineer with a minor in food. She is a lead auditor on ISO 9001. She is a coordinator of the ISO Spanish-speaking task forces for ISO Technical Committee 34, Subcommittee 17 on Food Safety Management Systems, and also for ISO Technical Committee 210 on Quality Management Systems and general topics related to medical devices. So with that, Peter, over to you.
It's muted. I should be sharing. Should work. You can see my slides.
Yes. Look great.
Okay, here we go. Thanks for the invitation and apologies for the organizers that my response was a little bit slow, but nevertheless I'm here and I'm ready to entertain you a little bit about ISO 13485 and a few other updates of ISO TC 210. I do have, as you just mentioned, Stephen, and thank you for that, I have the honor to be the chair of ISO TC 210 actually since the beginning of 2016, which was the year ISO 13485, the latest.
We cannot hear the speaker correctly. Is there anything he can do with his microphone?
I don't know if this is Bill Gates that doesn't like Apple devices, but
that's
is
louder.
it better now?
That's great.
Not better? No? Yes? Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, I do hear some echo in my ears, but if you can hear me, then that's all fine. Again, thanks for inviting me. And as I mentioned, I do have the honor to chair ISO TC 210, which is labeled quality management and corresponding general aspects for medical devices. And for the translators, I will try to speak a little bit slower than I normally do. The agenda or the list of topics that we go through very quickly, I have only 11 or 12 slides, is the introduction, the structure of the TC, the publications that have been accomplished in the last year, the current activities, and only a selection of that because we do a lot more than you might think. We have developed a new scope text for the committee that we believe is more up to date. We are in the process of establishing a chair advisory group, which has been fairly informal gathering so far. We are formalizing that, and I will say a few words on that, not a lot though. And then something about the future of ISO 13485. We had an FDA event yesterday where also the future of 13485 was briefly discussed, and I'm happy to share a few similar messages as we did yesterday. Stephen just mentioned everything that you're supposed to know about me a little bit more, but this is what I have been doing over the past some decades. And the most important one is, at least for this moment, being the chair of ISO TC 210. This is a snapshot of the website, ISO TC 210, and here you see the structure of the committee of the TC. There is an ad hoc group for ISO 22740, which is about color indication for medical applications. This is something of a bit of a tedious activity, but it may actually bear fruit in the next years. High-level structure analysis. This is an ad hoc group in support of discussions of the mandatory structure that ISO wants to impose on management system standards and that we do not really like. Dedicated ad hoc group to have a closer look into the scope of TC 210 that has not been modified since the committee was established in 1996, so good 25 years ago. Then we have a joint working group and several joint working groups actually with IEC 62A. And this one is one of the famous groups. It deals with the application of risk management to medical devices. And this is the home of ISO 14971 and also ISO 24971 technical report, which is providing some detailed advice on application of risk management. Medical device software, Joint Working Group 2 is not very active at the moment, but has been delivering several useful documents. Medical device usability is another one. And actually for Joint Working Group 2 and Joint Working Group 3, the lead is more with the IEC part. Joint Working Group 4, small bore connectors. This is a bit of a strange duck in the pond. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but it's dealing with basically connector devices to prevent misfits. Spanish Standardization Task Force, Veronica will tell you all about that, I'm sure. Then the Working Group 1, this is another pillar for TC 210, application of quality systems to medical devices. This is the home for ISO 13485. Working Group 2, general aspects from quality principles. This is the working group that has been developing the 16142, the chart that indicates the link between essential principles, which is the sort of a, let's say, template for a global regulatory framework for medical devices and connects them to a variety of international standards. So really very useful. Oh, here. Don't move until I say so. Working Group 3 is about symbols, nomenclature for medical devices. The nomenclature part has been abandoned to a large extent. Not sure if we will ever get it back, but for the time being, the work in Working Group 3 focuses on symbols. Connectors for reservoir delivery systems is a sort of a twin brother, if you will, from the Joint Working Group 4. also working on connector issues. Then we have a relatively new working group 6 on post-market surveillance. They have published a technical report 2 years ago, and post-market surveillance is typically underestimated by most of the players. So I think this work is quite important. And last but not least, we heard something about waste. Good engineering maintenance management is working on a new project dealing with life cycle of medical devices and maintenance of that. And that also includes activities on the decommission. What is missing here is the joint advisory group together with IEC on life cycle aspects of medical devices, which is sort of a think tank on more circularity in our activities within IEC 62 and ISO TC 210. Publications last year are only 4. So information to be supplied by the manufacturer, ISO 2417, a new edition of the medical symbols document, small bore connectors, part 5, corrigendum 2, and part 7. That suggests that there is not that much activity in TC210, and that's to some extent true. Here is a slide that gives you a few of the activities, but our intent is to develop documents that are, let's say, high quality. There's quality in the name of the committee, and that means that they don't need to be updated, revised, amended frequently, which I think is good for conformity assessment, because you don't want to be claiming conformity to, let's say, an unstable document. I put a explosion hazard sign here, discussing risk terminology at top level in ISO and IEC Joint Task Force. Risk is something that we know in the medical devices area as the combination of probability of harm and the severity of that harm. Now, there are some other groups in ISO that like to advocate a different understanding of the term risk. And we have wasted a lot of energy and a lot of time in trying to convince that regulations dictate what understanding of risk we will have to implement in our standards. That discussion has only started last week, at least that discussion on top level, but it has been ongoing for the last 5, 6, 7 years, and it's I find it dreadful. It is distracting from what I would consider real work. I have no clue how that works out, but it's I'm not having much fun of those discussions. Then briefly, the new scope text. This is not meant to modify the scope of the TC, although a little bit, perhaps. And on the left, you see the current text of the scope of the committee, which is pretty verbose. And we have been agreeing, and actually this has been approved, that we will use the text on the right, the proposed new text. This has now been adopted. And it speaks not anymore about medical device, but products with a health purpose. And the understanding is that products with a health purpose is definitely including everything that is labeled a medical device. But as you all know, a medical device, the definition of that is different for different jurisdictions, and may vary in time. So we felt that using the word product with a health purpose is a little more appropriate, because we have seen this sort of a scope creep in products that emerge on the market. Devices like Fitbits, for example, are interesting if you want to use to improve your health. Standards in principle, if they are labeled medical device, would not apply to those products because they're not a medical device in most countries. But if they are miscalibrated, they may create harm to the user. So this is why we are creating a little bit of leeway to open up potential for deliverables, for standards, for guidance, for products that are let's say, at the edge of a medical device, very close to a medical device. This is something I mentioned that before, a chair advisory group. This has also been the subject of many discussions with the ISO Central Secretariat, that we have this informal chair advisory group, but they feel that it needs to be more formalized. And our ambition is now, okay, we will formalize that, but at the same time, we want this group to be a strategic direction discussion group. So all the groups in liaisons and all the committees that are connected to ISO TC210 are invited to participate and to give their view what, where, how TC210 should work on. Now, this is about the future of ISO 13485, and the big question is, well, why would it have to change? There is no real reason for that. 2 years ago, and this is following a systematic review that ISO Central Secretariat imposed on us because we were not adhering to what was the mandatory high-level structure that comes with that mandatory definition of risk that doesn't work in our sector. That was a clear vote, clear systematic review outcome. There was a 33-to-1 vote that no, stick with the current document, don't touch it. So we decided to confirm it until 2025, but my prediction is that it will not change in the next 5 years, at least. So it's stable at least to 2027, and probably even longer. Now, that doesn't mean that it is fit to do what it's supposed to do, but make it compliant to the harmonized approach for management system standards, formerly known as high-level structure. No, we're not going to do that. Then there is a link with ISO 9001 because that was the foundation of the first edition of ISO 13485. Not even ISO 176 is at the moment planning to revise ISO 9001. So that doesn't bring any rationale for us to consider a change from that perspective. Now, there may be a need to have small updates, small clarifications. There may be some ambiguity here, although we do not receive a lot of feedback from the users. But that may be done via an update of what we call the handbook. And the handbook is here to help implementation of ISO 13485 if that is still necessary, or let's say within the regulatory context, and or for organizations that want to use it, that want to use the standard and to comply with it. It does have an interesting, and I don't have the details here, it does have an interesting layout because it gives for each of the clauses in the standard, the text of the standard, the intended purpose of that statement, and then additional text, additional guidance, so that you can understand better the background of why it was written the way it was written. And this is a little bit of the feedback after the systematic review, the early systematic review, because normally it is after 5 years. It's 5 years after publication. Now we were forced to do it 3 years after publication. And pretty much all the stakeholders said, don't touch it, leave us alone. We're still implementing it, so don't modify the document. And that was what we did. We are fairly okay. We are happy with the document. And so there is no real need to do so. Here are a few links. We do have an official ISO website, and we also have a bit of an informal public website. Well, this one is also public, if you will, but this one is intended for sharing some of the messages from the chair or from working group conveners if they want to convey some additional message to the public. We may perhaps use it, we haven't decided yet, if we want to have additional information, explanation, answers to question, and use also that public website for that. And I think that that's it for now. And this is sort of a good wish. If And this is in particular for the US FDA, who is planning to adopt by reference the 2016 edition of ISO 13485 in its quality system regulation. And I think that is a big step forward. I really congratulate the FDA for taking that bold step. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Very informative presentation. I have several questions for you, but I'm going to save them until the Q&A session. I would just say that for those, this is the first time that they're looking at the work of ISO TC 210, it can be a little bit overwhelming, both the scope of work and the number of acronyms and working groups, ad hoc groups, and task forces. But I would say for those that think that's a lot of work, think of how much work it would be if you have to replicate this at the national level. So that's one of the biggest advantages of doing this work in a collaborative fashion at the international level. Even if it's a bit of a headache, you do it once globally and together with the global community. And also, this isn't meant to be a session, which is the entree. This is just a sampler of the different activities happening within ISO TC 210. There may very well be, and often there are, day-long sessions on the work of individual subgroups, working groups, etc. So this is just meant to kind of turn the light on for many of those who have not yet been engaged in the work. So Peter, I thank you for that presentation, and I'll circle back to you with questions at the Q&A.
Absolutely, happy to answer.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to transition over to Veronica to talk about the work with the Spanish Translation Task Force with ISO TC 210 and liaison to the coalition.
Hey for everybody. Thank you very much, Steven, for the presentation. I'm going to speak in Spanish because it's my language. Thank you very much. Y muchas gracias a la Coalición Interamericana para la Convergencia.
I want to thank the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence for inviting me to this.
Les quería comentar que mi presentación se va a centrar.
So I wanted to mention that my presentation will focus in two main points. They're going to talk about a brief description on how the Spanish translation team works and relates to the TC Technical Committee 210. And on the other side, what are the main objectives of the Spanish translation groups? So right here on this slide, we see the confirmation of the TC 210 committee is done and how the Spanish Translation Task Force depends on the main structure of the committee. The official translation groups have a specificity because they depend on the technical committee, the corresponding technical committee, but they also depend on the structure of the other groups. We see this twofold dependency right here. I'm going to mention the acronyms, the STTF. STTF means Spanish Translation Task Force, and they depend directly of the STMG, which is the Spanish Translation Management Group. That's a ministry that is located in Spain, and the management group depends at the same time to the Technical Management Task Force. So the task force, the STTF, the task force for translation related to the TC 210, depend to the structure and have to answer back to the two committees, to the STMG and to the Technical Committee, to the TC Committee. Official translation groups are created when 5 or more member countries of the corresponding committee approve an initiative to create an official translation. The Spanish Translation Management Group was founded 22 years ago, and the Spanish Translation Management Group started working on official translations of Technical Committee 176. And I mean, going back in history, our official Spanish translation group or task force started at the beginning of 2019. And there was a mirror committee of the TC210 that we created in Argentina. And we identified that because of the publication of ISO 14971, which is talked about risk management, which is regulatory in many countries, they had the possibility or they had the interest of presenting this initiative to create the official Spanish translation task force, an official group depending on the TC210. The proposal was approved by the end of 2019, and the group began to work with the current structure at the beginning of the 2020. That same year, the group published the first Spanish document, which is ISO 14791 in Spanish. 971, I'm sorry. So what are the main objectives of the Spanish Translation Task Force? Well, the first one is to have one single version for all the standardization bodies. This is very important at the regulatory level because we can manage to have a consensus in the translation, and we can make sure that there is a clear understanding of what it says. Another objective is to make sure that the national translations are much more, the adoptions are much more agile, which means that they're going to use much more technical documents and also would contribute to the creation of other documents before the publication of it, especially those documents that are considered quite relevant in the sector. And with this, we can facilitate a regulatory application. And also something very important is to have cohesion in all the Spanish-speaking community. As I mentioned, the Spanish Translation Task Force that is for TC210 started working in 2020, and currently we have 26 experts working on it of 11 member states and of 2 observer states. When I say member states, they are member states of the Spanish Translation Management Group. And so in order to participate in that group, they have to be Spanish-speaking countries so that they can be part of that group. And we have 2 observing countries that are the United States and the UK. One of the main challenges the group had was to get a consensus of what the medical device concept was going to be, because national regulations use different type of terms to express the same concept. For example, we identified that in some of the regulations, they would use medical devices, in others they would use medical equipment, medical products, or even sanitary or health-related products. And so what we managed to achieve with this was that, well, in the reference documents, we would consider the medical device concept, which could be different from one country to another. And so the consensus was to get to a medical device term and to be translated always as dispositivo médico, that would be in Spanish, or producto sanitario. Those are the Spanish terms that they would use for medical device, and the acronym would be MD, so that we could facilitate the reading of this term throughout the document. Now, what is the work plan that we have as part of these task force, the Spanish Translation Task Force? Well, the members of the task force present different proposals based on the requirements that each one of their countries has. This proposal or this work plan is then presented to the management group, the STMG, that they then vote and to see what is the work plan that they're going to follow. And right now we're analyzing the application guide of the risk management guide, which is 14971, and we just had a meeting with the STTF group, and we presented that we wanted to update our work plan so that we could extend it. And so we're going to add the proposal to include the ISO 15223 Part 1 to translation, which talks about symbols, as well as the ISO technical report 24116 and the ISO 2417. So this proposal is going to be presented to the management group to be accepted in voting, and then we will present a new work plan. In the meantime, we're just working with the technical report 24971. So right here, I wanted to show you a tool that's quite useful for all who are working in standardization, and also for those who want to look for information regarding the different standards or that want to work in standardization, and so that they could see all the ISO standards that there is, and to be able also to see the standards that ISO published that are free of charge in 2020, and they can also see how you can look for the definitions in different languages, including Spanish. So this is an ISO online browsing platform. It's a very useful tool for anybody who wants to look for information regarding the standards or different regulations. And right here on screen, you can see the first standard that was presented officially in Spanish in the health-related environment. This was the 14971. So thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Veronica. Very informative. I don't have any questions right now, but I did just wish to highlight how helpful it has been for you to be the designated liaison of ISO TC 210-2, the coalition, and the role that you provide facilitating the work and making the ISO standards available in the Spanish language. I would just note that, I think ISO amongst the other SDOs has probably the most sophisticated mechanism for making the Spanish language translations available. But each SDO has their own model, and we, the coalition, have gone through and spoken with them, and they have demonstrated their willingness to work with the stakeholders and the national standards bodies to make Spanish language translations available as the national standards bodies and regulatory authorities and users have a need for them. So thank you very much for that information. In the interest of time, I'm going to transition. Thank you so much, Veronica. In the interest of time, I'm going to transition now to the next presentation on Iec Technical Committee 62. Brody Peterson will be our presenter. He's the Chief Regulatory Officer at Borderless MedDev, a consultancy in quality assurance and regulatory affairs for medical device manufacturers, assuring the regulatory compliance, safety, and performance of medical technology. Brody specializes in regulatory issues with the FDA's 510(k) process, submissions, Health Canada device licensing, CE marking, amongst work in other jurisdictions. Brody is the vice chairman of IEC Subcommittee 62A, responsible for the standard 60601-1 and its family of standards. Brody is the leader of the design spec writing group for the 4th edition of IEC 60601-1, and he is an electrical engineer from North Dakota State University. Brody, thank you for joining us today, and it's over to you.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Just a second, I'll share my slides. Can you see my screen? All right. So who is the IEC? The IEC is the International Electrotechnical Commission. It's a not-for-profit, non-governmental organization. It's been around since 1906. It was established to address electrical safety issues as the electrification of the world had started out and issues cropped up. There are roughly 200 different working groups within, or technical committees within the IEC. dealing with electrical equipment standardization, from components to transmission equipment to devices to medical devices, which is especially what we focus on in TC 62. We already heard the ISO covers a lot more general topics. The electrical issues are dealt with in the IEC. There we go. IEC Technical Committee 62 is responsible for the electrical equipment, and I added software. We've been recently working to identify that most software requires an electrical platform to operate on, and the equipment in our devices mostly are all controlled and run by software. So there's increasing focus in the development of the standards related to medical equipment within TC 62. TC 62 has been around since 1967 and provides guidance for the work of developing standards with respect to electrical medical equipment in practice. We have 4 subcommittees. 62A is the responsible organization for all of the common aspects of electrical equipment used in medical practice. So when there isn't a specific device standard, generally 60601-1 is the first standard that would apply, and then there are other standards that are in certain topic areas. There's a collateral standard for electromagnetic compatibility, or EMC, and coexistence of devices that use radio frequency, and making sure that RF doesn't interfere with other devices. There are collateral standards that call out requirements for usability. There are collateral standards that talk about requirements for devices that are used in a home care environment and emergency medical services environments. There's also a general standard that covers alarm functionality. I think that's most of them. Subcommittee 62B covers diagnostic imaging equipment like MRI, X-ray, and CT, mostly for diagnoses. Oops. Subcommittee, sorry, my slides seem to be jumping, sorry. 62C is responsible for radiotherapy equipment, nuclear medicine, radiation dosimetry. This equipment uses a lot of high energy sources, and the associated control of those energy sources is heavily reliant on software and is increasingly relating to artificial intelligence control. 62D is a subcommittee for particular medical devices. So this committee deals with all of the specific device type standards. So particular device standards such as for pulse oximeters, ECG monitors, ventilators, actually over 80 different individual device types are covered by 62D. So it's a very broad program of work dealt with by numerous working groups and joint working groups among within that subcommittee to address each of the individual types of devices. So the IEC 60601 family is a family of documents and standards. Particular device standards down here in the bottom are specific to a certain type of device, like I mentioned, such as a pulse oximeter. I spent over 15 years working at a pulse oximeter company, so it's one of my favorite examples. It's so well understood by myself. particular standards work to apply the general requirements to a specific device type, and they can modify or increase the requirements of the general standards to meet the specific needs of a certain particular device technology or implementation. So 60601 and its collaterals generally lead the activity of changes, and then the particular standards take time to catch up to the changes that are made in the general standards when standards are updated and revised due to needs and changes in the marketplace. So collateral standard is a unique term that's unique to the 60601 series, that relating to general other topics that are applicable to subgroups of devices, but not necessarily all devices within the medical electrical range. We have a number of joint working groups. As Peter mentioned, there's a joint working group with ISO TC 210. We also have working groups with ISO TC 121 on respiratory equipment, especially in Subcommittee 3, Joint Working Group 1 on critical care ventilators. The work in those ventilators initially was very mechanical, and over time has become much more electrical and controlled by software. And so the focus has moved more towards IEC and away from ISO as the focus of the electrical and software functions move the equipment forward. The 60601 series is not limited just to TC62, but to the subject matter. The TC62 also has the responsibility for IEC 62304, which is also focused on the general aspect of software development for medical equipment. So currently today in TC62, our work program, especially in Subcommittee 62D, many of the particular standards are being updated to align with an amendment that was published in 2020 to the full IEC 60601-1 series, and the base standard 60601 and all of its collateral standards. They were amended in 2020. And so those amendments are now being brought into the requirements of the particular standards where they need to be called out specifically. We are also starting preparations for a 4th edition of IEC 60601 to remap this, the collaterals and work into the general topics of the standard to make it easier to maintain and use for regulatory purposes and for manufacturers developing standards. So we are working to get started on that, so that early writing of the document will hopefully start in 2023. There will be ballots going out late 2022, 2023 to national committees where you will be able to see some of the proposals and the work that's being proposed. This might be a first step in getting involved with the development of this very important safety standard. We are also working in a committee on a common base standard for refurbishment of medical devices. There's an imaging device refurbishment standard, currently IEC 63077. With the goal of protecting resources and providing more access to safe devices for people. Yeah, it's common that a lot of devices are refurbished and sold secondarily on other markets. And we want to make sure that these devices are safe and fit for purpose, fit for use after the refurbishment, and making sure that they can serve a good need without just going to a landfill. So ways to get involved, contact your national committee to be appointed to working groups, maintenance teams, joint working groups and TC 62 and its subcommittees. We have a link to our website here. You can see the subcommittees are in the structure of the website, and we'd be happy to have additional help as we move forward to working on a 4th edition. Will take a lot of people's help to make it happen in a timely fashion. Questions, you can contact me at the slides below. Thank you.
Rody, thank you very much. Again, extraordinarily informative and helpful to the work of the coalition and what we're doing in this webinar series. I would just note that for those that do want to get engaged, as Brody mentioned, with the IEC work, they can contact their local national committee. The nomenclature is NC. If you're not familiar with who that is, you can either follow the link on his website. I note also that on the website of the Inter-American Coalition, we have links to the respective national committees. You can otherwise contact your national standards body, the ISO member, and they will often know who the respective national committee member is. So thank you very much. I don't have any questions right now, but we may in the Q&A. So I'm going to transition now to the next presenter. Thank you very much. Dr. Ken Kavanaugh has been employed at the U.S. Food and Drug Administrative Center for Devices and Radiological Health since 2003, and is currently a deputy director in the FDA's Office of Cardiovascular Devices. In this role, Dr. Kavanaugh helps to oversee the pre-market review, post-market surveillance, and compliance-related activities for all cardiovascular devices in the United States. In addition to these duties, Dr. Kavanaugh has worked extensively in the areas of standards and guidance development and international harmonization. He has co-led several International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF, Good Regulatory Review Practices, working group activities, and has contributed to multiple other IMDRF working groups. He is also active in ISO TC 210 and TC 150 working groups, and was previously the co-chair of ASTM International's F4 Committee on Endovascular Devices Test Methods Task Group. From 2016 to 2017, Dr. Kavanaugh relocated to Japan on an external fellowship and partnered with multiple Japanese healthcare-related government agencies and non-government organizations to further promote global regulatory collaboration and medical device development. Dr. Kavanaugh obtained a Bachelor of Chemical Engineering degree from Villanova University and a PhD in bioengineering from the University of Pennsylvania. And Dr. Kavanaugh, in a previous session, we talked about the Standards Conformity Assessment Program that the FDA has under CDRH and how helpful it is to kind of being connected on an ongoing and sustainable basis with the world of standards. As the previous presentations have outlined, it's rather difficult, if not impossible, for a national regulatory authority to keep abreast of all of the technological developments and standardization developments, and the CDRH's Conformity Assessment Program is one mechanism that has helped at least the US regulatory authority do that. So thank you very much for being with us here today. Over to you.
Thank you for including me, and I'm very happy to be here. You know, as you mentioned, hopefully you can see the screen. I mean, I think that you'd mentioned conformity assessment. I think there's a lot of activities. I'll just start off by saying a lot of activities CDRH tries to do in terms of getting the technical people involved with standards development and other harmonization activities. And for example, myself, I work in cardiovascular devices, but I've worked in other standards and harmonization activities. I think a lot of people do that, and it, I think, provides a good way to blend experiences from one area into the other, such that we can collectively work more effectively. So again, very happy to be here. At the risk of stating the obvious, I thought I would just start off a little bit about why harmonization is important. I think especially as regulators and not just industry, you know, in some ways we see a lot of value in it, particularly for medical devices as compared to pharmaceuticals, where you have a lot more variations in technology compared to drugs, where it's just a pill or injection usually, and you see a lot of differences in terms of the regulatory structures in different countries. So harmonization actually makes things a lot easier for us as well. Really increases the ability when we work together with other regulators, as well as industry stakeholders, to promote more consistent reviews and more efficient reviews, and really reduce a lot of the uncertainty involved in that process. We heard a little bit about Imdrf already. I mean, that's one of the ways where regulators strive for harmonization. It's a voluntary effort involving regulators from around the world to converge as much as possible in various regulatory areas. It's not a true standards developing organization, although it does have some aspects to that. There is a consensus aspect to it. We have non-regulators participating as observers, active observers in many of the activities. And like standards, we draft documents, make them available for public comment, and incorporate those comments when we release a final version. Again, the goal here is just to increase the regulatory cooperation around the world and the efficiency and consistency in the reviews. You can see here the current membership, the official members, as well as official observers and affiliate members, mainly regional harmonization activities, and you can see Latin America fairly well represented at all levels there. One of the activities I wanted to focus on specifically today that was most relevant to the discussion was Imdrf's Good Regulatory Review Practices Working Group, or GRRP. This has a very broad goal, high impact in terms of improving the consistency and quality of medical device marketing submissions, and just increasing the efficiency and competency of the review process. How can we kind of raise the quality of the reviews that we're doing and the quality of the submissions that we're ultimately going to be looking at as regulators? There are a few different documents that have been developed so far. The ones I wanted to focus on today are documents involving essential principles, or EPs. These are fundamental design and manufacturing requirements that provide some assurance that a medical device or an IVD is safe and performs as intended by the manufacturer. You can see here the two documents that focus on that that have been developed in the past few years, Imdrf N47 and Imdrf N52. I will discuss those in a little more detail here. Sorry, I keep having to move this. So for safety and performance, we heard a little bit, I think, about like the ISO essential principles earlier. These are fairly similar in concept. We have some general and specific risk considerations that apply either to medical devices or to IVDs, or both. Medical devices here meaning non-IVDs. In addition to laying out these principles, this particular document, N47, includes a list of relevant standards and guidance documents that might be helpful in terms of showing some conformity with those essential principles. You can see here some examples of some of the level of detail that the essential principles go into in this document. And at the bottom, there's just, again, an example of a representative essential principle. Again, somewhat similar to what you would find in ISO 16142. For labeling, which is document N52, again, there are labeling considerations for labeling elements or just labeling information, again, specific to medical devices or IVD or both, including not only various labeling elements like the packaging label or the instructions for use, but also different cases where there would be specific labeling considerations. If the medical device is just software, if it's intended for lay users, not just physicians or healthcare providers, how to ensure quality in that labeling. Again, a representative principle is listed here. So those exist. And there's also, as I mentioned, ISO essential principles that we heard a little bit about before that are developed in ISO TC 210 Working Group 2. And so we have Imdrf essential principles, we have ISO essential principles, and I think the question sometimes comes up, why are there two sets of essential principles? Is one more essential than the other? Are they both essential? How can that work? And just to provide some reassurance, I will say there was a lot of overlap in the groups that have developed these essential principles. They were developed at around the same time, and at least on the regulator side, many regulators participated in both groups. And I remember for labeling in particular, we had a joint meeting of ISO and Imdrf working together to, again, make sure that the essential principles don't conflict with each other. They line up fairly well. There's general agreement, but at the same time, there's not there are different focuses for some of these different documents. For IMDRF, since those are regulation focused, they may incorporate more regulatory considerations and are better able to discuss jurisdictional variations and account for those. With ISO, I mean, I remember with these documents, we try not to base the essential principles or standards on regulatory requirements. And so the discussion of regulatory requirements is handled a little bit differently. And really having the essential principles in a recognized consensus standard as opposed to an IMDrf guidance can have a different impact in some regulatory jurisdictions that rely a little bit more on standards-based demonstrations of safety and performance in order to support marketing. So different documents with similar content, but ultimately, hopefully, the same benefit for stakeholders in the industry. So those are more kind of high-level general documents, and the question comes up, well, what about performance standards? Device specific or just horizontal or vertical standards in general. How do they fit in with meeting these essential principles? I'll just say from our perspective, I mean, the consensus standards like this can provide harmonized approaches to meeting these essential principles. I mean, you can lay out there how a manufacturer can demonstrate how a specific essential principle is met using this standard. That's going to be, again, supportive of consistency and efficiency in developing these devices and reviewing them for marketing. One of the potential pathways to consider here is, if we're developing standards to meet a specific essential principles, can we map them in some way? Could the standard itself include a mapping to some essential principles? Could the regulatory authorities map them themselves? Are there ways we could use standards and EPs to better work together to support more harmonized regulatory review? Some of that comes down to the standards themselves and how, at the development stage, how to write them such they can best meet this goal. And both ISO and IMDrf have attempted to address this already. 16142, the essential principles there for safety and performance, as well as IMDrf N51, which was developed by the IMDrf Standards Working Group, have some fairly significant discussions about, here are some considerations for designing performance standards and adopting them for regulatory purposes to make sure that they can best meet that need. Just considerations like, is the scope appropriately defined? Can you tell whether a device is in scope or out of scope? You don't want to use a standard that doesn't apply to a given device. Does it have enough detail? Does it lay out the methods with enough detail? Does it have acceptance criteria such that you can expect the test to be very repeatable without a lot of variations depending on who's doing it? Was there a sufficiently broad stakeholder participation? Is this truly a consensus effort? Considerations like that are ultimately going to be very important when thinking about how to position a standard in terms of meeting essential principles for regulatory purposes. So that's like kind of past work. I mean, current and ongoing work within GRRP has focused in a somewhat different direction. Now that we've established really, I guess, the considerations for marketing a medical device, how to demonstrate safety and performance there. The most recent batch of documents has focused on establishing baseline principles for a third-party review of device marketing. How can separate non-regulator conformity assessment bodies, or CABs we call them, review these ways in a way that, or reviews these devices in a way that creates credibility for their marketing and allows regulatory authorities to accept those decisions in their jurisdiction. So far, those documents have addressed the competencies of the CAB reviewers and personnel, the recognition process and requirements by which CABs can be allowed by recognizing regulatory authorities to do these reviews. And most recently, the current work product is focused on the review process for these CABs. This has a few different applications. Not only could this help support a third-party certification type program within a given region, but it could also provide a foundation for a potential future medical device single review type program, like we already have for auditing. If we get to the place where there is such a program, standards would be expected to play an important role there, ensuring appropriate consistency and rigor in those reviews. Again, that's really where consensus and international participation really builds in quality. And so we definitely hope to see more standards development be tied to more of a global single review program going forward. Just some final thoughts, just to tie it all together, as hopefully I was able to demonstrate that the Imdrf work and consensus standard work kind of complement each other. They work together to promote convergence in medical device development and review practices. As these activities go forward, I expect and hope really standards development activity and integration with regulatory guidelines will increase and will further enhance device harmonization activities. And just want to again kind of hopefully demonstrate that the importance of global participation in standards development and really encourage continued development in your medical device environments to support that by really increasing the number of standards we have out there, their applicability and their utility. I think that's ultimately going to be good, not only within our respective regions, but more globally. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Ken. Extraordinarily informative and helpful. And I think it's a good reminder to all that the really good guidance that the IMDRF has in its essential requirements goes directly to how regulatory authorities should be using standards. And I note also that in one of the previous presentations, we saw that the reference to the ISO standard 16142 and how that may be continued in the future, noting that it contains the list of the 200 or so standards that are used by medical device regulatory authorities and industry around the world, and that they may be seeking a more dynamic way to be maintaining that list as opposed to being an annex in an ISO standard. So thank you very much. I know we're running a little bit behind schedule, and I know that some of our FDA and PAHO colleagues have a hard stop at the top of the hour. We will continue along at an executive pace, but I did wish to see Alexandre Lemberger, just so that we don't run the risk of missing you. Would you like to make any of your remarks just before we go into the next speaker? If not, we can catch you later.
Thank you very much, Steve. Well, I would try to. I have a meeting at 1, so I would try to follow the presentation until 1, and then I will have to leave. Thank you very much for your passing me the opportunity to give some remarks. So first of all, I would like to congratulate FDA and Coalition and USAID for this very important initiative. This is a series of webinars. We're already in the second series of webinars, and I participated in a few of them, but my team definitely, I think, participating in all of them. They are very well received in the regional working group for medical devices, and the level of participation. As you know, many, I would say most of the regulatory authorities that part of the members of the regional working group have been participating in the sessions and make very positive comments. So it's a really important initiative. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's PAHO is really interested in collaborating with this initiative. As you know, we have been developing a series of activities in capacity building and several aspects of the good regulatory practices. But the issue of the standards is now in the agenda, and we really want to collaborate and work together. As I mentioned, FDA now has recently joined the regional working group. For us, it's excellent news. As you of course know, but I can share with other colleagues here, PAHO and the coalition have been working in the last few months in building a formal agreement. I think that's for this year, for sure in the next, very shortly, we have a formal agreement established, which will allow us to develop a series of joint activities. We are going to have our regional group meeting, which is, we have to decide about the dates, but we're supposed to have it early April, but it's probably have to postpone for late April. But we are definitely having a regional meeting, virtual still, but it will be a great opportunity to have our stakeholder meeting, very similar to those stakeholder meetings that Imdrf, but of course a regional context, which is very important. So I would send invitations very soon, and we are discussing the agenda with the coalition, with FDA, with all the regulatory authorities here represented. So I just say my word of thank you for the invitation, for the participation. Thank you and congrats for the organization. I would not name all of the people that are involved in the organization, but of course, Sandra, of course, you, Stephen, FDA colleagues, very kind in inviting us to participate. And you can count on PAHO to work with the regulatory authorities, strengthening regulation of medical device in the region. And this particular issue of standards, I think definitely is one of our priorities right now, and you can count on us to work in collaboration. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Alexandre. And as many on the audience will know, PAHO wears several hats. It's, of course, a 120-year-old organization in the Western Hemisphere, and it also wears the hat of being the representative of the World Health Organization in the Americas. And also, as Alexandre mentioned, having a regional liaison with the Imdrf and really working with the national regulatory authorities that are not already members of the Imdrf. So thank you so much, Alexandre.
Thank you.
With that, I'm going to move in sequence to HO on the next item on our agenda, talking about the work of the Association of the Advanced Medical Instrumentation, AMI, AAMI. Ms. Cho's focus of work is with the general aspects of medical electrical equipment and software. She staffs both domestic and international work in that area. She is also active with the American National Standards Institute and is a member of the Board of Standards Review and serves as the vice chair for the U.S. National Committee Technical Management Committee, which oversees all of the United States Mirror Committee work to the IEC. With that, hey, thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
So I'm starting to share my screen. Thank you very much. And I'm so happy to be here. And I hope everyone's doing great. It's hard for me to see my screen. Let me try to move it over. Okay, so I have been with Amy for a very long time. And oops, sorry, I think, oh goodness, sorry about this. I thought it would move with me, but it's not. Okay, so AMI or AMI is a US standards developing organization, but I just wanted to give you guys a brief introduction and a way for you to get involved. So who is AMI? We are a professional society, of those that are interested in health technology. We're not a trade association. We don't deal with advocacy. We're basically a standards developing organization. We also have several education programs, certification programs and such. We have over 10,000 members. They include health delivery organizations, industry, vendors, government, technology professionals, engineers, doctors, nurses, clinicians, academics, students, all types. We have over 500 corporate members and institutional members. And so, the other part of the 10,000 is individual members. We are strongly involved in bringing the expertise and experience and convening with diverse stakeholders to drive consensus in our standards development process. We are accredited by ANSI, American National Standards Institute. We administer several ISO committees and the US TAG or the US Mirror committees for that. We also administer a few IEC committees as well and serve as the US TAG for that as well. And we also, AMI develops its own American National Standards and technical reports. So our standards philosophy is basically one product, one standard, one test worldwide. I think that's been brought about, with the WTO and other presentations here. That's then, that's the way going forward. The size of our standards program, we have over 170 domestic committees, and we have close to 300 standards and different reports that we've published. As we stated before, 11 ISO or IEC secretariats, and run 18 US tags or US mirror committees. And we have about 2,300 active domestic program participants. I wanted to highlight here that these are domestic programs, AMI run programs, but that doesn't mean it's all US folks participating. We are open to international participation as well. For US tag or US mirror work, they have to be domiciled or headquartered in US, even if you're outside of US. But for our AMI committees, we do have participation from different international groups or individual members who have expertise or want to be involved. So Amy's role with IEC, we run the secretary for IEC Subcommittee 62A. I'm not going to go into all the names and stuff because I think that's been brought about during the rest of the presentations. We also have the 62D work as well. And then we run the US TAG or US Mirror Committee for the TC62, the main committee, as well as the subcommittee 62A and D. For Amy's role with ISO, we have several more groups that we deal with. I think in general, Amy has most of the secretariats or US tags that's in the medical healthcare sector for IEC or ISO. So we deal with the secretary for ISO TC 121, which is the anesthetic and respiratory equipment, and also run the subcommittees for 2, 3, 4, and 6. And we hold the secretary for ISO TC 150, subcommittees 2 and 6. So we run the US tags for all of those, plus a couple more subcommittees for 121. And we also administer the secretary for ISO TC 198, which is the sterilization group. It's a fairly big and robust group in healthcare domain, and the secretary for ISO TC 210. Which we went into many details about. And so because of that, we have the US mirror committees for those. The 3 that we do not have the international work for, but we hold the US mirror committee or US tag work for is ISO TC 76. It's on transfusion, infusion, and injection and blood processing equipment. The US tag for ISO TC 84, which is on devices for intravascular catheters. And the US tag for ISO TC 194, which is biological evaluation group, and their subcommittee 1 on tissue safety. And the other role that's not quite defined international role, and this is something that I run as well, I serve as the secretary for ISO TC 215, IEC subcommittee 62A's joint work group 7, which is on software within the health informatics group. So it's got a diverse work program, so we wanted to mention that as well. So I know this was something I believe the Corey from COPAN was trying to address on the US adoption. So basically, when you have the US tag or US mirror committee, and I'm just speaking from US side, it may be very different from the different national committees, but from the US side, if you have the mirror committees, you have basically the first right to adopt any of the IEC or ISO documents that that's under your purview. And for us at AMI, the decision to propose the adoption is really undertaken by our technical committees and working groups. If they feel the need, if our members feel the need that this needs to be done, or if we have a strong FDA, asking for us to be done, for that to be done, we would undertake that. And they can decide to adopt the document, identically, harmonize with it, or have national deviations. Our adoptions go through the same process as we would do for an American national standard, the ANSI approval process. And that's how that's dealt with. We do try to adopt most of the documents that we hold this US tag for, but we don't do all of them. And we try to do the ones that are, important or under high regulation, or there's a big national deviations to it. But if our members are requesting, then that's something that's taken under consideration. So the types of documents that we develop at AMI, it's our purview is kind of the medical healthcare topics that are under our domain, and we have ANSI approved standards and US adoptions. We have the AMI technical information reports. And just within the last 2-3 years, we started doing these AMI consensus reports. And especially during COVID-19 time period, we had a lot of documents go out. And consensus reports are kind of like white papers, but they are balloted by consensus. So it's kind of in between a white paper and a technical report. It's something that we do try to get out as fast as possible, try to be agile, and we hope that it'll be in turn be turned into a standard or a technical information report. So the standards involvement at AAMI, and I wanted to give two different scenarios, and it's kind of, so basically you can participate in our AAMI domestic committees or a US tag or US mirror committee. And out of that, once you have some expertise or some knowledge, then you can be nominated as a US expert on an IEC or ISO working group, maintenance team, joint working group, whatever the name is. But in both cases, you are helping to develop the ISO and IEC standards, because as an AAMI committee member, you may be the technical expertise, the subject matter committee that we reach out to, and the US tag is the official member that votes on any of the documents that come down the line from IEC and ISO. And especially if you are appointed as a US expert, then you're on the front line working on the documents directly. Some few key areas in the AAMI standards program. I just wanted to highlight these just so that, because I think there's some documents that are out there that people are just aware of. So in our sterilization program, we have ANSI AAMI ST79, that might be a name that people are aware of. Electrical safety, we have ES 60601-1, which is, it's our adoption of 60601-1, but there's a couple of big national deviations to it. That's why the numbering is a little different. In the human factors usability arena, we have HE75. We've adopted the 62366 document. The quality systems, we already went over 13485, 14971, 24971 in risk management arena. We've adopted those, so those are US adoptions. In the biological evaluation sector, we have adopted, I think, most of the ISO 10993 series. I wanted to highlight one of our big area that we are focusing on is the Artificial Intelligence Committee. We do have a consensus report that's due to come out within the next 2-3 weeks, and that will immediately be issued or balloted as a technical information report. We're working with the BSI, so that will also be a British standard, and then the gist of that material will be proposed internationally and worked on at the IEC ISO level, probably next year. So how to get involved? This is the link to our website. You can go in the standards section. You can look at how to join the committees, what kind of committees that we have, their scope of work on everything that we do. And so I just wanted to say thank you. And if you have any questions, my name, contact information, or you could also email standards@aami.org for any of the information. I'm sorry for the dog howling in the background. But anyways, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hey. Excellent presentation. For those that wish to get in contact with Hey, her information is provided here. As we mentioned at the beginning, all of the proceedings, the videos, and presentations will be made available in the 3 languages on the coalition website as soon as possible. And we also have additional resources on the coalition website regarding the organizations and SDOs such as AAMI. So thank you so much, Hey. With that, I'm going to shift over to CLSI and Patrick McGinn. Patrick is Vice President for Marketing and Membership at the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute, CLSI, responsible for marketing, membership, technology, education, customer service, and communications to ensure activities are consistent with CLSI's mission and strategic priorities. And Pat is going to speak about CLSI and its role supporting ISO Technical Committee 212. Pat, thanks for your patience. Over
Thanks,
to you.
Stephen. And I'm glad to be joining everyone today. Let's shift my screen here. See, is that sharing okay? Or let's see here. There we go.
Seems like it's not quite in the right mode. I don't know, Sandra, if you have, there we go. Perfect. Thank you.
That's working. So good afternoon, everyone. As Stephen mentioned, I'm with CLSI, Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute. And today I'm going to cover a little bit about CLSI, as well as CLSI's involvement with ISO Technical Committee 212, and a little bit about CLSI's standards and educational products. CLSI develops standards for the medical laboratories. CLSI standards are really focused on helping laboratories meet accreditation requirements, as well as various global regulations for getting not only accredited, but also product approvals. CLSI has approximately 24,000 members through member organizations. So CLSI is predominantly an organizationally based standards development organization. We have approximately 1,700 organizations that are members of CLSI, about 400 individuals. We have representation globally from about 75 different countries supporting CLSI membership. CLSI is the secretariat for the ISO Technical Committee 212, responsible for the international standardization and guidance in the field of laboratory medicine and in vitro diagnostic test systems. In addition, CLSI administers the US tag to the ISO Technical Committee 212. Technical Committee 212 has 44 participating member organizations, 29 observing countries. We have a structure of 5 working groups, as well as a few joint working groups and task forces. As noted on the slide, the working groups are focused on the different areas of the laboratory, between the quality and competency, the in vitro diagnostics products, microbiology and molecular documents, and biorisk. Recently, the most recent publication from the Technical Committee 212, this past towards the end of 2021, was a document focused on laboratory testing, the susceptibility testing of infectious agents, and the evaluation of the antimicrobial susceptibility testing devices. A few of the upcoming publications from the various working groups, product that focused on in vitro diagnostic test systems, really centered around some of the acute respiratory syndrome, and in particular with SARS-CoV, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought there. But in effect, in addition, we're dealing with a lot of the information around the pandemic here. Also a document focused on intro diagnostic monitoring systems. A few of the new projects that have been recently accepted for development are the ISO 5649, which is focused on laboratory developed tests, as well as ISO 7552, which is specifications for pre-examination for circulating tumor cells, as well as isolated RNA. And so these projects are going to be developed in a series of different parts. Just to cover a little bit about CLSI as the standards development organization. So we have approximately 250 standards and guidelines, various other educational type products. CLSI focuses on 12 specialty areas, as highlighted on the screen here. Everything from automation informatics to hematology to microbiology, newborn screening, point of care testing, and quality management systems. So CLSI's the 1,200 or so volunteers are really focused in these specific 12 areas that are highlighted in developing not only the new trends within these areas and focused on, but also the revision of a lot of core topics, in particular with microbiology and the method evaluation. Some of the recent publications from CLSI are highlighted here, and well, I'm not necessarily going to go through all of these documents, but the CLSI's most distributed document here just recently was published. It's the M100 document. It's the performance standards for antimicrobial susceptibility testing. So this is the one CLSI standard that is published annually, right around this time of year. And so this just published within the last few weeks. This is a document we've also worked with in the past with PAHO, very often with distribution into with a lot of the PAHO regions and partners. And so we're currently continuing to discuss the release of this year's publication as well with PAHO. In addition to publishing standards, CLSI is very involved, in particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, with a lot of training initiatives. So CLSI has works with some staff and contractors across various engagements to really help prepare laboratories for accreditation. And so we cover the various topics of CLSI documents, as well as helping labs that are focused on ISO 15189 accreditation. And so currently CLSI is working is working in about 15 different countries and has been engaged since 2005 in a lot of these international training. And so this is an area where we regularly will send not only staff, but local representation to contractors to help us further train and prepare laboratories to meet accreditation. In addition to the standards and some of the actual on-site training, CLSI has a series of online e-learning programs that really help to guide users through our standards. And in a few series of new products are implementation guides. So CLSI has started as part of their education line to develop tools that really help walk the user through the actual content within the standards. Some of these are also helped to guide through electronically. And so these are some new products that might be of interest as well. For more information, as well as opportunities for volunteering, CLSI does have a volunteer, international volunteer base. And so we often regularly post this information on the CLSI website, and would definitely recommend viewing the information on the website for upcoming volunteer information, as well as the latest information on our standards and publications.
Thank you, Patrick. Very informative and helpful information regarding the work of CLSI's, also ISO Technical Committee 212 on laboratory and diagnostics, which is important at any time, but particularly in focus in the global effort against COVID-19. So thank you again very much for that information. As with the other STOs, this information will be on the website following the presentation. With that, I'm going to move in sequence to Caroline Hall, who's the General Secretary of DICOM, the Digital Imaging and Communications in Medicine Standard, recognized by ISO as ISO 12052. Ms. Hall also serves as Manager of Global Regulatory Standards for the Medical Imaging and Technology Alliance, MITA, M-I-T-A. And Ms. Hall previously worked at the Deloitte Center for Health Solutions and at the District Policy Group, a government relations firm. She previously served in multiple roles in the federal government, working for a member of Congress, covering health, education, and telecommunications, and as a senior analyst in the Obama White House. She also worked at the Pan American Health Organization. Ms. Hall holds a Master's of Health Administration and the Certificate of Healthcare Corporate Compliance from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And Ms. Hall graduated with a bachelor's degree from Illinois Wesleyan University in psychology and Spanish. She is also certified in healthcare compliance from the Compliance Certification Board and holds the Associate Standards certification from the Standards Engineering Society. With that, Carolyn, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. And I'm sharing my screen.
I see it. Thank you.
Great. So overview of MIDA. MIDA is the collective voice of medical imaging equipment, radiopharmaceutical manufacturers, innovators, and product developers. So our companies represent sales for more than 90% of the global market for medical imaging technology. And as Stephen mentioned, we're also the secretariat for the DICOM standard. Our medical technologies that MIDA covers include medical X-ray equipment, CT scanners, ultrasound, nuclear medicine, PET, radiopharmaceuticals, MRI, focus ultrasound, and imaging information systems. And we have sections that are specific product types, and this is where our standards are drafted. And then we also have committees which cover more overarching topics. And for sections, those people who draft the standards must manufacture the equipment. So everyone participating in drafting these MIDA NEMA branded standards have to manufacture those products. And I should also mention that we're a division of NEMA, the National Electric Manufacturers Association. So in case you see NEMA standards, we're all the same organization. And you may have heard earlier about some other organizations, but we are a trade association and a standards developer. And some of our standards that you may have heard of before are NEMA XR29, Smart Dose, and then XR26 on CT. And so why do we at MIDA draft standards? So some reasons we as MIDA draft standards are new technology. For instance, focus ultrasound is a new imaging modality that's come out. So perhaps we'd write a standard on that or another new modality. There may be needs to update existing standards. And we also draft standards in reply to the FDA. They may request us to draft something, for example, on a safety concern. So one example is there's MS-14 on coil heating and MR systems, and this was in response to an FDA request. And we work with them informally, and they could, provide us comments and feedback on the standard. And so types of standards that we draft, NEMA MIDA branded standards, and for those, there'll be MIDA members participating, so the manufacturers of the systems that I mentioned. These are MIDA rules and procedures. One example of this is that we're working on is acoustic noise measurement for MR devices. And then we also draft within NEMA American national standards, similar to some of the other stakeholders that you've heard from earlier. So these would include other stakeholders, and they fall under the rules for consensus bodies. And so one that we recently completed was on supplier credentialing. So salespeople, those coming into health systems during the pandemic, we wanted to make some updates to the rules for those and have a broad overarching standard so that it's not different for each hospital, each health system that these suppliers may be entering. And so our relationships with international standards, want to add that, as we've heard a lot of today, which is great, we strongly support harmonization of regulation via standardization, and glad to hear a lot about that earlier today as well. And many standards are involved in the development of medical devices, as you probably already know. 60601 standards, ISO 13485, which we've heard a lot about. And some ways that we might use standards in relation to international standards is perhaps we draft a MIDA NEMA standard that we'd later like to be included in an IEC or other international standard. So many of our members participate in IEC, ISO, ACM, and AMI standards efforts. So that's some of the relationship between the two. Perhaps we draft it so that it could be included in an international standard later. And we also serve as the tag secretariat for 62B and C and TC 87, and then on the NEMA side for many other IEC committees as well. As for the US tag groups, members don't have to be a MIDA or NEMA member to participate. I just wanted to note a bit more about DITA. So we're a member of DITA as MIDA, which is the Global Diagnostic Imaging Healthcare IT and Radiation Therapy Trade Association. And together we monitor and comment on Imdrf activity, and MIDA and DITA members participate where permitted. And as we know, Imdrf documents support harmonization and convergence, which we all support. And other members of DITA include ABIMed from Brazil and MedTech Canada. So those are the Americas members of DITA as well. And I wanted to highlight, I think we've heard some more about this earlier, but additional learning opportunities for standardization. So the first one is just to participate in these international standards efforts, just dive in and begin learning. IEC does have really great programs and online resources through the IEC Academy. ISO also has resources and toolkits available for members. And then I also wanted to highlight young professionals opportunities. So for your folks who are newer to standards development, the IEC has a great program. I know ISO has in the past as well. So your national committee would be the one to nominate folks to participate, and they attend the meeting, the general meeting in October. This year it'll be in San Francisco. So that's a really great opportunity, the IEC Young Professional Program, and I can't recommend that enough. And that's all I have for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you so much for that information. Very helpful. And similar to the previous presentations, all of the information that Carolyn has will be made available on the website, and with including in how to get engaged in the MIDA activities and MIDA activities in support of international standardization. With that, I know we're running past, but we are going to power through. We're almost there for Craig's presentation and then the Q&A, which I'm looking forward to. Craig Updike is the Director for Global Policy and International Trade at ASTM International. Craig joined ASTM in 2020 and is based in Washington, D.C. Among his roles is promotion of policies and awareness that enable regulators to choose and access international standards based on relevance and technical merit. Craig, thank you very much for bearing with us, and we're very glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks to everyone for hanging in. Let me share my screen here. Did I get the right one? Yes, looks like. Can everyone see that? Okay. Can you see it, Stephen?
Not yet.
Okay, let me try again. Thought I'd gotten it. Here, there we go. Share. I think that's what I didn't hit, is share.
There we go.
Now you should be able to see it. So thanks everyone for hanging in. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Craig Updike. I'm with ASTM International. Let me advance the slide here. Thank you very much for this time today to brief you on our activities that are relevant to medical regulators in the Americas. Here's a quick snapshot of what I will cover very quickly in the short time we have. A little bit about ASTM International. ASTM is a globally recognized leader in the development and delivery of voluntary consensus standards. Out there in the global marketplace, we have over 13,000 ASTM standards. that are used to improve product quality, enhance health and safety, strengthen market access and trade, and build consumer confidence across 90 industries. And our leadership in international standards development is driven by the contributions of our members. We have more than 30,000 of the world's top technical experts and business professionals representing 140 countries. And this is an important distinction to draw. ASTM members are individuals, not national committees. And I'll add that the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement does not require that the sources of international standards be bodies that use the national delegation approach. ASTM's open and transparent process meets all 6 of the World Trade Organization's principles for international standardization and ensures that all interested individuals can participate in developing test methods, specifications, classifications, guides, and practices that support industries and governments worldwide. ASTM also has an advanced IT infrastructure in place that facilitates participation by anyone from anywhere in the world. ASTM technical committees are active in several areas of direct interest to medical device regulators, and I'll get into this a little bit more in more detail in a minute, but those include technical committees on medical devices, additive manufacturing, plastics, and pharmaceuticals. Many ASTM standards are optimized for use by regulatory authorities and are used by them. In addition, we operate several young professional and professional development and training programs, so we may be able to help address your needs in those areas as well. So a key message for us is that ASTM can be a strong partner for you because ASTM has the tools to address regulator concerns and needs and is a part of the international system for standards development in the medical technology space. Move on. So we do encourage participation from around the world and from at whatever level of an organization you might be operating in. ASTM has in place memorandums of understanding with over 115 regional and national standards bodies. Of those, 31 of those bodies are in the Western Hemisphere, including the national standards bodies of Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, etc., as well as CrossQ in the Caribbean and many others. And our objectives in working with those national standards bodies in the hemisphere are multiple. I'll mention a couple of them here, really to build awareness and recognition and support for an engagement in ASTM International in the region, promote participation in the development and use of ASTM standards by the public and private sectors in Latin America, serve as a point of information for requests from anyone, from stakeholders or the public or government agencies, support requests for ASTM services, and promote standards education and related ASTM activities for students and professors. And we also operate several student chapters as well. Overall, we have an ASTM Memorandum of Understanding program that, first of all, provides access to these national and regional standards bodies, access to a full collection of ASTM standards for adoption, reference as use as the basis of national standards or consultation. We also provide no-cost membership for any stakeholder in the signatory NSB's geography. And we provide access to special training programs to help build knowledge and capacity and the ability to contribute in these technical committees. ASTM standards are developed and published in English. With market demand as the primary factor, ASTM translates approximately 200 standards into Spanish each year. Access to these ASTM translations is only available directly through ASTM. A list of Spanish translations is available on our website, and we also translate a number of standards into Portuguese each year. If a regulator in Latin America desired to have an ASTM standards translated into Spanish or into Portuguese, the national regulator could work with its national standards body that likely has an MOU with ASTM, or the regulator can reach out to us directly, to me or to our Latin America director, Mr. David de la Garza, and I can connect you with him very easily. So, my contact information is on the last slide here. So we really encourage you to reach out if you're interested in getting involved or getting access to standards, or in English or Spanish or Portuguese. But to step back one more step, Latin American national or regional standards bodies that have memorandums of understanding with ASTM International, such as AB&T in Brazil, Iec in Colombia, and many others, those MOU partners of ASTM are permitted to translate ASTM International standards into their national or regional language for technical purposes. But the rights of the intellectual property rights of the standard are retained by ASTM. And we do request a copy of the translation, since we need to give consideration to the accuracy and quality of the translation. And to make sure that we know which edition of the standard was published. We do revise our standards regularly, and we want to make sure that the translation is kept up to date. And I should point out, we do have a regional representative in Lima, Peru, who supplements our Latin America director, David de la Garza, who is based here in the US. You are probably most directly interested in ASTM Committee F04 on medical and surgical devices, which includes participation from many companies and institutions. I'm told that there are many ASTM F04 standards that are referenced in ISO standards, such as implants for surgery, which is TC 150, prosthetics and orthotics, which is TC 168, and many others. ASTM Committee F04 was formed in 1962. The full committee meets twice each year, in person if possible, in May and November, with about 190 members attending over 2 days of meetings. The full membership of the F04 committee is approximately 900 individuals, and that committee has jurisdiction of over 305 standards. F04 has 34 technical committees. I've only listed a few of them here on the slide, but you can find the full list on our website. Just go to astm.org and type F04 into the search box, and you will find the full list. The technical work has continued over the past couple of years in the absence of face-to-face meetings. Virtual formats, which we have been able to use for quite a while, were fully used. And let me know if I can help you find anything about F04 or about any of the other committees that I will talk about here. Here are some other, here's a quick snapshot of other technical committees in ASTM International that may be relevant for your work. A few highlights I'll point out. We do have a very active, very robust activity in additive manufacturing. We actually partner with the ISO to develop standards in additive manufacturing. And I recently personally worked with our additive manufacturing committee and our Center of Excellence on some comments to the US Food and Drug Administration regarding their work looking into 3D printing additive manufacturing of medical devices at the point of care, which is an emerging possibility and concern from a regulatory point of view. Committee F42 does have a subcommittee dedicated to medical applications of additive manufacturing. Moving into the PPE area, our F23 committee on personal protective equipment has been very busy the last couple of years during the global health emergency. ASTM standards for PPE are viewable for free on our COVID reading room. And in particular, our new standard F350221 for barrier face coverings is recognized not only by the US FDA and a number of increasing number of regulators around the world, but also the World Health Organization, and is included in their guidance on COVID-19. Committee F48 on exoskeleton technology is in the process of organizing a new subcommittee on medical applications of exotechnology. And as you see there, ASTM has 2 centers of excellence in additive manufacturing and exotechnology. And the purpose of those is to accelerate standards development by aligning the standardization roadmap with the R&D and innovation roadmap. So just a little bit more about some of the PPE related activities that we have gotten involved in the past year at ASTM. We do convene a global collaboration forum on advancing PPE safety, quality, and innovation. That is open to anyone who would like to participate. And actually there's a meeting coming up next week. So if you go to that website or you can contact me, I can get you plugged into that meeting and that forum. It is an ongoing forum with international participation. Another thing I wanted to touch on very quickly is the work we're doing with the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, to really promote awareness, capacity building, and standards cooperation and good international practices, related to PPE. Let's see. So the last 2 slides I have really gives you a little bit better understanding, I hope, of the partnerships and collaborative approach that ASTM takes in supporting global regulatory convergence. Here are some examples. I'll quickly highlight our collaboration that I mentioned earlier with other international standards developing organizations, such as the IEC and the ISO, our participation in the UN ECE and the OECD, and especially a case study of ASTM that the OECD published last year, that it really explains very well the role that ASTM plays in international regulatory cooperation and convergence. And then just the last takeaway message for you is that ASTM is open and transparent and globally active in our scope and in our reach. In our science-based and market-relevant approach to standardization, our collaboration, and our focus on technical quality. ASTM technical committees are open to participation from anyone. ASTM standards are fit for purpose and used by government regulators. ASTM standards can be made available in other languages, including Spanish and Portuguese. And this process can be facilitated by cooperation agreements ASTM has with national and regional standards bodies here in the Western Hemisphere. So, and the last slide has my contact information. I really encourage you to reach out if you think that ASTM could be helpful to you. So back to you, Stephen. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Craig, and for the wealth of information, which will also be posted on our website. And thanks to all of you observing and sticking with us here to the interesting section, which is the Q&A, when we have an opportunity to go back and digest and some of this the wealth of information. I note that we had presentations covering the work of 6 standards developing organizations that work on medical technology international standardization. And if you are a regulatory authority or if you're a company, you may be wondering, how on earth could I possibly stay abreast of this information? It's just too much for one organization, for one person. How do we stay on top of this to ensure that we're using the latest standards, that the technical regulations are based on the latest standards, that they're relevant? And I'd say one resource for you is the Inter-American Coalition. That's one of the parts of our mission, to be a bridge between the technical people and the policy people and the government affairs teams and the trade teams and the lawyers across different languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. and being a resource of information on where to start, where to go, how to get engaged, and critical to international standardization working and international regulatory convergence happening is a concerted co-responsibility and effort to systematically be prioritizing the use of relevant international standards as a basis for technical regulations. If we want to look at what does regulatory convergence look like at the practical level, it really means not just an agreement to converge over time, which it is, but one of my favorite sayings is if you aim at nothing, you will hit it. And one of our objectives needs to be that the number of standards, country unique standards and technical regulations that we're developing each year, it needs to be zero. Otherwise, we're not going to hit it. And the way and it may be a decade-long journey, maybe it's 5 years, but we need to set that goal of at some point using the relevant international standards as a basis for technical regulations, which is consistent with the World Health Organization and PAHO guidance that you heard at the beginning of the session. It also happens to be a legal obligation in terms of international trade and the technical barriers to trade agreement and other bilateral agreements. And so I want to go to the Q&A session with one question that was posted, and I'll open it up to all the panelists, and then we'll work to maybe over the next 5 or 10 minutes wrap it up. So again, thank you so much for your patience. Question posted says, considering that there is a set capacity by both regulators and industry, how would you recommend to prioritize the SDO technical committees to participate? So where do we begin? And maybe I'll just put that out to the panelists and let you jump in and let the conversation unfold from there. And please, no one be shy. Carolyn, Hay, Patrick, Veronica, Craig, where should regulators and industry start if this is kind of like the first time that the door is open to them on this world of medical device international standardization? How do they prioritize?
Well, Stephen, I can take a quick stab at that. I would hope that the regulators would have some policy guidance from above about how to set their priorities. But I would really encourage anyone to use the ASTM process since we are I believe more open than others to just walk in and get involved and start using the ASTM committees as an opportunity to get a feel for standardization. How does this happen? How does an individual provide technical input into a standardization process? And then as other speakers mentioned, there are a lot of experts who are involved in multiple organizations. You can use ASTM as a networking opportunity to get involved, to meet a lot of those experts who are involved in those other organizations and are really seeking alignment between the standards, as was talked about very well by others. So I don't know if I answered it very well, but I think there's an opportunity to get involved and then see the whole world of international standardization open up before you. Maybe if you take a step into ASTM first, and then you can meet a lot of the people who can help you, the real experts who can help you prioritize how you can use the limited time and effort and resources that you might have to devote to international standardization.
Thank you, Craig. And I note that there's not a public health system in the world that has resources sufficient to its mandate, and hence the importance of the WHO guidance on the stepwise approach to really, for the health authorities to prioritize what their health objectives are and to leverage international resources and regulatory reliance and recognition and standards to help achieve their objectives. Veronica, would you might perhaps like to provide any of your opinion on how standards users should and regulatory authorities should begin in engaging in international standardization? And then I'll move on to you, Ken.
En castellano lo voy a decir.
I'll say it in Spanish for me. Many times, if we want to prioritize participation, the first thing you should analyze is the GDP of the country, right? Start from there. What is the gross domestic product, so as to start channeling the participation in those areas in which there's more relevance for the country. And speaking of health, the health sector, it is always a priority. However, the GDP sometimes is not enough for you to get the significance. It is through the stakeholders that you can see what is the best committee for you to participate, maybe.
That's sound advice, and I think should go into the considerations of any country as they look to prioritize their resources. I think it would be informative, Dr. Kavanaugh, for the audience to hear kind of the thinking of the FDA regarding its approach to standards.
No, I appreciate you, the question and the chance to weigh in. I mean, we actually do within our center have a certain priority system that takes into account, what is the public health impact, or there emerging issues here involving a device that could really support, not travel right now, but at least participation in standards development activities. Again, as I mentioned, these activities are all taken care of by people who are otherwise doing their day jobs within the center. And so it becomes a matter of supporting, okay, why is this investment of time going to be valuable for us in the long run? I mean, I do feel like the standards can be a way to address, if we see an issue with a given device area, if a review team, let's say, sees they get a lot of submissions in a given area and they have to ask the same question every time, then it becomes a matter of, would it be helpful to get a standard out there? If we could always try to publish like an agency-specific guidance document, but an actual standard may have a different impact, a different level of penetration. We may be able to get to a little more specificity. And so how can we use our existing networks within an appropriate technical committee, or make a new work item proposal to be able to help address that particular issue? So some of it is kind of reactive in that sense, but I think there's also opportunities, as I mentioned, going forward, to be proactive. What are the areas where kind of the opposite happens? We're seeing the same types of technology coming in. We seem like we're reaching a stable paradigm in terms of device development, the device features, and the device test methods. Maybe now these would represent suitable candidates for a more harmonized approach, where a standard could be adopted in a more meaningful way by multiple regulatory authorities. And so being able to think, hey, maybe just adopting our current processes or our paradigm for review into a new standard, for instance, that may be a good investment of time as well. It may be somewhat limited amount of time that gets put into it, but some significant payoff globally down the road. So, I mean, just thinking in terms of like the proactive and reactive aspects associated with medical device development, as well as review, at least from a regulatory standpoint, those could be some ways to do it. I recognize with our center, maybe it's easy for us to say. I think we're a fairly large agency compared to others, and so it's possible to spread the work out. But even still, we have to make tough decisions sometimes in terms of what the resources get spent on. And just having those kinds of considerations can be helpful in terms of what's likely to provide a benefit, a real benefit in the short term. So yeah, I'm interested to hear other perspectives as well on that.
And just as a follow-up to that, I've always been amazed just observing that the size of the CDRH staff is roughly 2,000. But CDRH has said that it does not have sufficient resources to develop US unique technical regulations and standards for medical devices that are not based on international standards. Hence, the establishment of the FDA Standards Conformity Assessment Program. And then you look at the resources available elsewhere, many orders of magnitude smaller than that. Could you just follow up and maybe speak to just building on the first webinar series and then your comments today on how that program has been helpful in the FDA working on regulatory convergence for the medtech sector?
Right now, I think it's, things are still, I guess, in a somewhat early stage in terms of like our standards conformity assessment program. I think there's a lot of lessons that could be, we're still in the process of learning from that in terms of how can we truly make this reduce the burden for manufacturers as well as for us? Can we think about, I think we're already starting to think through this, what would be appropriate? What does conformity, let's say a test laboratory's conformity to a given standard that they're certified for, what does that mean? Does that change the documentation requirement for that particular test? Does it change our ability to ask questions? How can we at least translate that into, again, some greater reliability and efficiency in the review? If we can maybe start with some of the more, I don't want to say standardized, but areas where sufficient standards exist and they're fairly prescriptive enough such that there, like I said during my talk, there's not a lot of ambiguity in terms of how to interpret the results. You have a very clearly defined method, you have clear acceptance criteria, sample preparation, considerations like that. Maybe working with those kinds of standards and moving towards some of the less well-defined ones, maybe some of the higher level, more abstract ones. Maybe applying lessons learned from a previous stage to a more, I guess, risky in that sense phase can be an important approach to take. I think as a center, we're trying to say, okay, this is something maybe we haven't done before, but let's, again, think about the benefits. How can we communicate those benefits both externally as well as internally, and maybe take a stepwise approach in terms of making sure that this is going to be ultimately useful for the community as a whole. Nobody wants to have a program that isn't going to be useful. And as always, if there's other perspectives on how our programs are going, how we're using standards, what else we should be considering, we're always happy to receive that feedback.
Thank you so much. And with a view to closing out the session here, I wanted to see if any of the other panelists have any final remarks or questions, noting that we have no additional questions in the Q&A right now. Any final remarks by the panelists?
I could jump in with something real quickly. So within Iec TC 62, Imdrf established a liaison with us. And, there's a bunch of essential principles and the rules that govern some of the documents that they want to look at. But so far, participation itself hasn't been very active. So it would be great if they, I know the liaison status is there, so we could provide reports back and forth, but, and we do have some regulators that participate within our TC62 work program, but not all. So, that's another mechanism for you to gain, because right now we have a placeholder liaison person, but that could be a different role, and they actually have full access rights to all of the documents and anything that's going on within Iec TC62 directly. And I know they can do the same thing with ISO TC210, other groups like that. So just FYI.
Thank you, Hey. Any additional remarks, comments from the panelists? If not, then I wish to thank all of you very much for the wealth of information that was shared. I'm going to pass it back to Sandra to close us out today.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you very much for all our panelists. I think it was really wonderful to have these for many of us, like first approach to the world of standard development organizations. I think next step is to go and dig deeper and get a much better understanding, but starting to realize how we better organize ourselves to leverage the resources that are available, and how we can, as both working together, regulators and the private sector, can really move forward into the adoption of international standards, and how we, through that, make it possible for innovative medical devices and medical technology to become available at a country level at the most appropriate cost-benefit balance. So with that, really, thank you very much. I mean, starting from PAHO and the possibility of having all the support from them and the World Health Organization in regards of implementation of good regulatory practices from the health perspective, and also with that, having the ability to ensure that the regulators are in a position to to ensure compliance with their legal obligations, again, in regards of good regulatory practices. And then closing with a more like day-to-day activities. How do we really gain access to all this knowledge, and how do we apply it again in a more effective way through an active participation? And I think that this active participation is a core responsibility. It is not only something that we are encouraging regulators to become more involved at, but also the private sector. It is a joint effort, and we all have to work together in order to achieve a better outcome. So with that, I really want to thank you again, all of the attendees to our session. And I would like just to close by reminding all of us that our next session is planned for March the 10th at 10 a.m. Eastern time. And in that session, we're going to be now listening on the perspective from the national standard bodies on the utilization of voluntary consensus standards and conformity assessment. So with this, thank you very much, and look forward to meet you all next Thursday. Have a great rest of your day.